In the late 1990s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side, one by one, quietly. According to police records, most were Indigenous women. Many struggled with addiction. Many survived escort. Their absence did not trigger alarms. Not at first. The downtown east side was already marked by poverty, violence, and mistrust of authorities. Disappearances blended into the background noise of daily survival. According to investigative journalism from the Vancouver Sun, and later confirmed in court documents, families who did report missing loved ones were often told the same thing: she probably moved on. The atmosphere was heavy with resignation. Fear traveled faster than information. Women warned each other about dangerous clients. License plates were memorized. Streets were avoided after dark. Though darkness was unavoidable, there was a sense that something was wrong, but no clear shape to name it. By 1997, advocates working in the area began to notice a pattern. Too many women are gone. Too many without contact. According to later findings from the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, at least dozens of disappearances shared similar timelines and last known locations. Still, the cases were handled separately. Files was opened, then closed again. For the families, the wait was agonizing. Birthdays came and went, but there were no calls. Mothers kept their daughters' rooms untouched, hoping for their return. Sisters went out themselves, searching in alleys for any sign. Later testimony revealed that many families felt abandoned, left to investigate on their own in a city that didn't seem to care about their missing daughters. The police investigation was disorganized. There wasn't a central team, a common strategy, or enough resources. Also, biases influenced what they focused on, a fact that was admitted much later. Anything that couldn't be immediately proven was dismissed as mere chance. But coincidence has limits. As the years passed, the absences accumulated. Names began to repeat in whispers. And somewhere outside the city, according to what investigators would later uncover, a place existed where answers were being concealed in plain sight. By the end of the 1990s, the disappearances were no longer isolated in the minds of those closest to the victims. Mothers compared notes. Outreach workers kept informal lists. According to investigative reporting later reviewed by the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, more than 30 women connected to the downtown east side had vanished over a span of years. The timeline overlapped. The geography overlapped. The risk factors are also similar. Police files show that reports were scattered across divisions and jurisdictions. Some women were logged as transient. Others were classified as high-risk lifestyles. In several cases, missing persons reports were delayed or downgraded. According to internal reviews later made public, there was no centralized database tracking patterns among the disappearances until years later. Each case stood alone, stripped of context. The atmosphere within the community shifted from worry to dread. Women spoke of a man offering rides. A pig farm outside the city was mentioned in rumors. License plates were partially remembered. According to outreach testimonies, these warnings were passed to police more than once. None led to immediate action. Without bodies, without witnesses willing or able to testify, suspicion remained unformed. Inside police departments, a different pressure existed. Serial murder was an extraordinary claim. It required extraordinary proof. According to later police statements, officers believed many women would resurface, as some had in the past. Resources were stretched thin. Jurisdictional boundaries between Vancouver and the surrounding municipalities complicated coordination. What seemed like caution, in retrospect, became a delay. Families felt dismissed. According to court testimony and media interviews, several relatives were told their daughters were adults who had chosen to leave. The unspoken implication was clear. Some lives were considered harder to lose track of than others. That assumption would later be cited as a critical investigative failure. By 2001, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police began reviewing older files more closely. A tentative task force was formed. Analysts started mapping last known sightings. Patterns emerged slowly. The same corridors, the same time windows. Still, no suspect. The unease deepened when women who were presumed missing did not resurface. Years passed, no phone calls, no bank activity, no confirmed sightings. Absence became evidence, though it was not yet enough. According to later findings, this was the moment when the investigation stood at a crossroads. Either the pattern was a coincidence on an unprecedented scale, or someone had been operating undetected for years. Where had all the women gone, and who had the power to make them disappear without consequence? The name surfaced quietly, long before it carried weight. Robert William Pickton, a pig farmer in Port Coquitlam. According to police records, his property had already been mentioned in allegations years earlier. Not murder, not disappearance, but violence. In 1997, Pickton was charged with attempted murder after a woman escaped his farm and reported being stabbed. The case collapsed when the victim, struggling with addiction, was deemed unreliable as a witness. The charges were stayed. The file was closed. The farm remained. Pickton lived with his brother on a large rural property bordered by ditches and fields. Pigs numbered in the thousands. According to later court testimony, parties were held there. Locals called it Piggy's Palace. People known as escorts were present. Some were observed leaving. Others disappeared afterwards. However, at the time, there was not enough evidence to prove anything. Rumors circulated in the downtown East Side. Outreach workers warned women to avoid a man with pigs. According to the Missing Women Commission, these warnings reached police informally. Without corroboration, they went no further. Pickton was not listed as a suspect. What investigators did not yet know was how often Pickton's name had brushed against the margins of law enforcement. He had been questioned before. He had been noticed before, but nothing had stuck. His lifestyle appeared unremarkable. No criminal convictions, no obvious motive. According to later psychological assessments introduced at trial, Pickton presented as socially awkward, unassuming, and easily overlooked. The farm itself became a kind of blind spot, large, chaotic, difficult to search without a cause. According to police statements, obtaining a warrant would have required specific evidence tied to a specific crime. That evidence did not yet exist. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. By early 2002, more than 60 women were officially listed as missing from the downtown East Side. The task force was under pressure. Public concern was growing. Media scrutiny sharpened. The idea that a predator could operate for years without detection was no longer hypothetical. On February 5, 2002, in February of that year, police returned to Pickton's property, not for missing women, but for an unrelated investigation involving illegal firearms. It was a routine warrant. According to investigators, no one expected what they were about to see. Inside a trailer on the property, police found weapons. But they also noticed something else. Items that did not belong to a pig farm. Women's clothing, personal jewelry, prescription bottles bearing female names. According to the investigation file, these discoveries were outside the original scope of the warrant, but they could not be ignored. What had been routine became charged with unease. A second warrant was requested, then a third. As investigators expanded their search, the scale of the property became a problem. 43 acres, dozens of buildings, thousands of animals. According to forensic testimony, the farm was cluttered, unsanitary, and overwhelming. Evidence could be anywhere or nowhere at all. Each step forward raised the possibility that crucial proof had already been destroyed. Then the lab results began to arrive. DNA testing revealed traces of human remains mixed with pig tissue. According to forensic experts who testified at trial, this was not an accident of farming. It was consistent with deliberate processing. Further tests linked DNA from the farm to women who had been reported missing years earlier. Names that families had never stopped saying were now appearing in scientific reports. The feeling among investigators hardened into certainty. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide investigation. Possibly many. Pickton was arrested and initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Police stated that he showed little reaction to the arrest. He spoke casually and acknowledged knowing the women. However, he did not offer any explanation for the evidence against him. Later, he spoke to an undercover officer, and what he said would significantly alter the course of the case. The search continued, uncovering more remains, teeth, bone fragments, and personal belongings. Each item was carefully catalogued, representing a life cut short. The Crown stated that the sheer amount of evidence surpassed any previous serial murder investigation Canadian law enforcement had managed. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred, it was how many times, and how many truths were still buried beneath the mud of the farm. The search of the Picton farm did not end quickly. It stretched over months, then years. According to court records, it became the largest forensic investigation in Canadian history. Specialists worked in rotating shifts. Anthropologists, DNA analysts, and evidence technicians combed through soil, buildings, freezers, and waste pits. Each location carried the same quiet tension. Anything could surface. What investigators found was fragmentary, bone shards no larger than coins, teeth embedded in mud. Traces of DNA were recovered from tools, containers, and processing areas. According to forensic testimony, many remains had been mechanically altered. Some had passed through rendering processes used for animal byproducts. Identification became a painstaking act of reconstruction rather than recognition. Yet names began to emerge. Through mitochondrial DNA and personal effects, investigators linked remains to women who had been missing for years. Some were confirmed homicide victims, others could only be described as probable. According to the prosecution, the evidence supported a minimum number of victims, but not a complete count. The farm had erased too much. The atmosphere around the investigation grew heavier with each confirmation. Families were notified in stages. Some received answers, others received uncertainty. According to victim impact statements later entered into the record, knowing was both a relief and a wound. The waiting had ended, but the truth was incomplete. Picton remained in custody. According to police records, he began speaking to a cellmate who was, in fact, an undercover officer. In those conversations, Picton allegedly described killing dozens of women. He spoke of a goal, 50 victims. According to the investigation file, these statements were recorded. They were chilling. They were also legally complicated. Confessions without corroboration could not all be charged. Prosecutors faced an impossible balance. Charge too many counts without sufficient physical proof and risk acquittal. Charge too few and risk minimizing the scale of harm. According to Crown strategy documents later discussed in open court, they chose a focused path. Few cases with solid proof that can result in convictions. Outside the courtroom, the public struggled with the same question that investigators could not fully answer. If this much had been found, how much was gone forever? And if justice could only name some victims, what did that mean for the rest? The trial ahead would offer accountability, but not closure. The trial of Robert Picton began in January 2006, 4 years after his arrest. According to court transcripts, the judge imposed strict limits on what the jury could hear. The scope was narrow by design. 6 counts of second-degree murder, not the full number of investigators believed possible. Only the cases with the strongest forensic grounding. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy but controlled. Families filled the benches. Some clutched photographs. Others stared forward, unmoving. For many, this was the first time the system appeared to acknowledge what had been taken. But acknowledgement came with conditions. The jury would not hear about the alleged confessions to 50 victims. They would not hear about every recovered fragment. Too much risk of prejudice. Too much complexity. The Crown focused on evidence. DNA recovered from the farm. Personal items traced back to specific women. According to forensic experts, the probability of innocent transfer was astronomically low. The narrative presented was methodical. This woman was last seen here. Her DNA was found there. Her remains were processed in a way consistent with human intervention. Each case stood alone, yet echoed the others. The defense pursued a different strategy. They did not deny the presence of DNA. They questioned contamination. They questioned lab procedures. They suggested secondary transfer. According to defense filings, the argument was not that Picton was innocent, but that certainty was unattainable. Reasonable doubt lived in the margins. Picton himself testified. His demeanor was subdued, at times detached. According to journalists present in the courtroom, he spoke plainly, often without emotion. He denied intentional killing. He suggested accidents. He positioned himself as overwhelmed. Incapable of the precision the Crown described, the contrast between the evidence and his affect unsettled the room. After months of testimony, the jury deliberated. On December 9, 2007, they returned verdicts. Guilty on all 6 counts of second-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was the maximum available under Canadian law. The families reacted in silence, then tears. Justice had been delivered, but in fragments. Outside the courtroom, the question lingered, unresolved. After the verdict, the number refused to settle. 6 was the legal count. It was not the human count. According to the investigation file, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police identified DNA belonging to at least 33 women on Picton's property. 26 of them were confirmed murdered. Others could not be definitively classified due to the condition of the remains. The gap between what could be proven and what likely occurred became the central wound of the case. Picton's own words complicated everything. In recorded conversations with an undercover officer, he allegedly spoke of killing 49 women. He described mistakes, described learning curves. He spoke with an unsettling lack of urgency. According to prosecutors, these statements were credible in tone but legally insufficient without corroboration. Confession alone, without physical linkage, could not sustain charges. For the families of women not named in court, the trial felt incomplete. According to public statements and inquiry testimony, many felt erased twice, first by the killer, then by the limits of prosecution. Closure remained theoretical. Grief stayed active. The atmosphere shifted from shock to reckoning. Media attention intensified. Journalists began asking not just who Picton was, but how he had been able to operate for so long. According to the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, systemic failures were now impossible to deny. Reports detailed bias against escorts and Indigenous women, missed opportunities, fragmented policing, warnings dismissed. The question of numbers became symbolic, not a tally, but a measure of institutional blindness. How many disappearances does it take before a pattern becomes undeniable? How many warnings must be ignored before silence becomes complicity? Picton was transferred to a maximum security prison. Appeals were filed, most failed. His legal presence faded, but the shadow of his alleged victim count remained. The number hovered, unresolved, in headlines and memory. And beyond the statistics, a deeper realization emerged. This case was not only about one man, it was about a system that decided, too often, that some lives could vanish without urgency. The case did not end with the sentence. It widened. In the years following Robert Picton's conviction, the province of British Columbia faced questions it could no longer defer. Public pressure mounted. Families demanded explanations, not apologies. In response, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry was established in 2010 to examine how dozens of disappearances could unfold over more than a decade without decisive intervention. The findings were restrained in tone but severe in implication. According to the Commission's final report, systemic bias had shaped investigative priorities. The escorts were viewed as transient. Indigenous women were treated as high risk rather than high value. Information was siloed. Warnings were dismissed. Opportunities to intervene earlier were missed. Not once, but repeatedly. The atmosphere around the downtown East Side changed, though not quickly. Memorials appeared. Names were spoken publicly. Advocacy groups gained visibility. Some policing reforms were introduced, including improved interagency coordination and revised missing persons protocols. According to official statements, these changes were intended to ensure patterns would be recognized sooner. Whether they would be was a question only time could answer. For the families, justice remained partial. Some never received remains. Some received confirmation without context. According to victim impact statements, grief did not resolve. It adapted. The knowledge that their daughters had mattered, finally acknowledged by the state, arrived late and at a cost that could not be repaid. Picton himself receded into the background of the prison system. His appeals failed. His parole eligibility date remained decades away. He no longer occupied headlines, but his case did. It became a reference point in Canadian criminal justice, a warning, a case study, a reminder of what happens when marginalization meets indifference. The social lesson was not abstract. Serial violence does not thrive on secrecy alone. It thrives on neglect. It survives where attention is withheld and assumptions replace urgency. The women did not disappear because no one was looking. They disappeared because, for too long, no one with power chose to see. And the question that remains is not how this happened, but whether it could happen again. One peaceful afternoon in Florida, a 13-year-old girl walked into her home to find her 4 younger siblings screaming, crawling around in red stains on the floor. Small, bloody footprints all over the kitchen. There was no sign of forced entry, no goodbyes, just 5 children, left alone beside their mother's body, and the killer who had vanished as if he had never existed. To understand why a mother became the target of such a vicious plan, we must go back many years to where the tragedy really began. Sheila Lee Walsh, born in Topeka, Kansas on October 19, 1962, met her first husband, Alan Blackthorne, shortly after finishing high school. Sheila was small, kind, and quiet. She had a difficult childhood. Her father, an Air Force pilot, was often away, and he died in Laos when she was only 10 years old. She longed for stability, for love, and for a family she could build with her own hands. After college, Sheila found work as an office administrator at a local law firm. That was where she met the charming, confident Alan, a man who quickly swept the inexperienced young woman off her feet. On their 3rd date, he proposed. Within 3 months, they married. Born in June 1955, Alan was 7 years older and, at least on the surface, far more worldly, but Alan's past held shadows Sheila never saw. Long before adulthood, he showed concerning behavior, cruelty toward animals, obsessive attitudes toward girls, even an accusation of attempted abuse while in high school. He had several minor criminal charges, but thanks to a string of lenient judges and expunged records, the man standing before Sheila looked clean, respectable, harmless. Alan easily gained the trust of Sheila's family. Even after the wedding, none of them suspected what was coming. Soon, he convinced them to invest a large sum into his electronics business, claiming he was preparing to expand. They had no idea the business was already failing. By the time the truth surfaced, Alan had declared bankruptcy and whisked his young, pregnant wife off to Hawaii, far from home, dependent and expecting a baby. Sheila found herself cornered, torn between her loyalty to her parents and the father of her unborn child. She still hasn't realized the cruelty of the man she has been with all her life. Years later, much would be revealed. Alan had been married before. His first wife, Eileen, endured extreme physical and psychological abuse, choking, beatings, even being kicked in the stomach while pregnant. Immediately after childbirth, Alan insisted they give the baby up for adoption because he wasn't ready to be a father. His violence extended beyond people. When their dog had an accident on the carpet, Alan beat the animal to death. Not only that, at one point, he forced situations where Eileen's younger brothers would witness intimate moments, and he often pressured her into degrading scenarios for his satisfaction. He also had a habit of dressing in women's lingerie before asking to be driven to rough neighborhoods, where he would wander home alone, a dangerous thrill he craved. Eileen and her husband had a bad marriage that lasted 5 years. During that time, she became pregnant again. Frightened, she decided to have an abortion and secretly began making plans to leave him. His second wife, Mary, initially believed she had met a loving, attentive father figure, but the facade shattered quickly. Alan used her 2 young children to manipulate and control her, threatening violence if she ever tried to leave. After 3 years of escalating intimidation, she fled with her children in the middle of the night, fortunate to escape the prolonged torment Eileen endured. Then came Sheila. When Alan met her, he saw vulnerability and opportunity. They married in 1982. Until that moment, Sheila had no way of knowing about his abusive past or hidden obsessions. At first, he was everything she thought she needed: loving, attentive, protective. But the mask slipped. Slowly, affection turned into criticism, criticism into anger, and anger into daily emotional warfare. Sheila was young, inexperienced, conditioned to believe that any outburst from the man she loved must somehow be her fault. And Alan, skilled in manipulation, took full advantage of that. The turning point came 6 months into the marriage, when Alan, with Sheila in the passenger seat, was involved in a collision with a motorcyclist. The rider died at the scene, and Alan immediately fled, terrified that witnesses had seen him. He phoned his father, who urged him to file a false report claiming he had been attacked by an aggressive stranger and had driven off only to protect his pregnant wife. Alan was eventually charged with fleeing the scene of a fatal accident and failing to render aid. But the case ended in a hung jury, and the district attorney declined to retry him. In the end, Alan walked away without consequences, despite being responsible for the man's death. After the couple relocated, Alan resumed his attempts to revive his business ambitions. During that time, Sheila's sister visited and was alarmed by her appearance. Sheila was pregnant, but she looked shockingly frail, like the starving children often shown in charity campaigns of the 1,980 seconds. Sheila later admitted to her parents how grim things had become. Yet, despite everything, she had no intention of leaving her husband. Financial dependence kept her trapped. Alan was launching a new business selling electrical muscle stimulators. To secure support, he persuaded relatives to move with them to Honolulu. But in July 1985, the enterprise collapsed. Alan continued advertising the devices, but authorities arrested him and seized his inventory because he lacked the required permits and the machines failed certification. The incident erupted into a public scandal. After the business failed, Alan took Sheila back to California. There, Sheila confided more openly in her sister about what life in Honolulu had been like. Alan frequently insulted her, accused her of affairs, flaunted his own infidelities. He would bring other women into their home and have loud, intimate encounters within earshot of his wife and daughters. Sheila endured it all because she felt financially paralyzed. She had no savings, no support system, and had been isolated from her family. Back in the mainland United States, Alan again managed to attract investors for another business venture, once more involving muscle stimulation devices, this time medically approved. It was during this period that his cruelty escalated. Sheila's sister noticed that Sheila looked older, exhausted, and physically unwell. But alongside this decline came a flicker of resolve. For the first time, Sheila expressed a desire to leave him. A notion sparked after Alan tried to drown her by forcing her head into a toilet and flushing repeatedly. In September 1987, another attack occurred. Alan beat her with a belt before bed, then struck her repeatedly with his fists. Finally, Sheila called the police. Police arrested Alan, but the consequences were minimal, a fine rather than jail time. Sheila seized the chance to flee. She gathered her daughters and ran to the home of Janda, the family's former nanny. Unfortunately, Alan anticipated her escape and intercepted her there. While Janda hurried the children inside, Alan began beating Sheila. A neighbor witnessed the assault and rushed over, managing to drive Alan off. Furious, Alan climbed into Sheila's car, ran over the neighbor, smashed through a gate, then escaped in his own vehicle. He was arrested a few hours later. Miraculously, the neighbor survived with minor injuries. Alan received a $425 fine and 18 months of probation. Following Alan's arrest, Sheila fled with her daughters to Oregon to stay with her sister Carrie. She hid there for several weeks before realizing she could not live indefinitely in secrecy. She needed to face the legal process if she hoped to protect her children permanently. In October 1987, she wrote a detailed, 100-page account documenting years of Alan's abuse. By September 1988, the divorce was finalized in Sheila's favor. She received custody of their daughters, a vehicle, and $1,250 a month in child support. Later, Alan persuaded her to move to San Antonio, promising to buy her a home so she could live closer to the girls. Sheila eventually agreed, a decision she soon realized was a devastating mistake. Once she moved, Alan immediately began manipulating the children against their mother, and child support payments were routinely delayed. Sheila knew Alan had the financial means to pay. He simply chose not to. She had to take him to court for nearly every payment. Alan, obsessed with retaliation, studied family law constantly, searching for loopholes to use against her. He eventually succeeded in reducing the child support amount to $350 in a hearing Sheila hadn't even been notified of. That reduction forced her into further litigation. After additional hearings, the original support amount was reinstated, but each payment remained a battle, a deliberate torment Alan never stopped inflicting. Frustrated and desperate to receive compensation for the years of abuse she had endured, Sheila went back to court demanding her share of Alan's assets. But Alan was exceptionally skilled at hiding his money. Instead of the roughly $250,000 she was entitled to, Sheila received only about $22,000. Despite everything she had suffered, Sheila was determined to rebuild her life and create stability for her children. In August 1992, she met a gentle, soft-spoken man named Jamie Belush. Their relationship blossomed quickly. The two were married in June 1993. Jamie was a devout Christian, a former Marine, and an employee at a pharmaceutical company. Life finally seemed to be turning in Sheila's favor, but Alan was far from finished. He continued to look for new ways to torment his ex-wife. The day before Sheila and Jamie's wedding rehearsal dinner, Alan picked up the girls for a routine visit. Instead of returning them, he sent a bailiff to serve Sheila with yet another lawsuit, this time demanding expanded custody. Sheila and Jamie married the next day, but their honeymoon was overshadowed by the legal hearing that followed. As the girls grew older, around 8 or 9, Sheila began hearing troubling things from them. Her daughter, Stevie, eventually confided that Alan had touched her inappropriately. Sheila used this revelation as leverage. When Alan attempted to file another custody-related lawsuit, she informed him she was prepared to report him for molesting their daughter. Stevie's statement was formally recorded, but Sheila refused to make her daughter face the trauma again in court. The threat alone was enough. Alan backed down. From then on, all communication between them went strictly through attorneys. The children no longer wished to visit Alan, and meanwhile, Sheila began building a new life with Jamie. He wanted children of his own, but Sheila struggled to conceive. They turned to IVF, and in December 1995, Sheila gave birth to quadruplets, 3 boys and 1 girl. For a moment, the chaos of the past seemed finally behind her, yet danger continued to haunt her. When Sheila was 7 months pregnant, her sister Carrie came to visit. Just days earlier, the O.J. Simpson verdict had been announced. Hearing that Simpson had been acquitted of murdering his ex-wife terrified Sheila. She told Carrie she feared that if Simpson could get away with it, then Alan, who had spent years threatening, stalking, and tormenting her, might convince himself he could kill her too. Carrie tried to reassure her, but Sheila remained shaken. She even asked her sister to care for her children if anything ever happened to her, and to contact a woman named Enrule to share what she feared. By June 1997, Alan had filed yet another lawsuit, angry that Stevie had stopped visiting him. Sheila was prepared. She warned him plainly that if he pursued the case, she would report his inappropriate behavior toward their daughter. Realizing she was serious, Alan abruptly withdrew the lawsuit. Shortly afterward, he announced he wanted to terminate his parental rights altogether. Even so, he continued to stalk Sheila from a distance, and she believed he never stopped plotting revenge. Alan manipulated a neighbor into spying on her, convincing the woman that Sheila's children were being mistreated. The neighbor even installed enormous floodlights that shone directly into the Bellish family's bedroom every night. Sheila and Jamie complained repeatedly, but law enforcement did nothing. Eventually, the constant harassment drove them to make plans to move. One afternoon, while the nanny was watching the children, Sheila and Jamie returned home to discover that Daryl, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, had visited her father. Despite losing all parental rights, Alan had still managed to see her. Sheila panicked, terrified he would discover where they were planning to relocate. In a moment of anger and fear, Sheila struck Daryl once with a belt. With Alan's encouragement, Daryl filed a domestic violence complaint, and because Alan no longer had legal rights to her, Daryl was immediately placed into protective custody while an investigation began. The court eventually found no evidence that Sheila or Jamie had abused or coerced their children. The family then quietly moved to Sarasota, Florida at night. But even there, peace was short-lived. A neighbor from Texas eventually revealed their new address to Alan. Daryl, still in state custody during the ongoing proceedings, remained a constant source of anxiety for Sheila and Jamie, who feared she might unintentionally disclose their location. The Bellishes were so cautious that even their closest friends back in San Antonio were told nothing more than a post office box number. During this period, Sheila's anxiety reached its peak. Even though she had been divorced from Alan for nearly 10 years, the fear that he might someday kill her never left her. And tragically, her fear wasn't irrational. Behind the scenes, Alan Blackthorne was actively trying to track her down. He first hired a private investigator to locate her. When that didn't work, he pressured the man into surveilling every Baptist church in the region, hoping to spot Sheila among the congregations. The task was unrealistic. There were simply too many churches, and the investigator eventually abandoned the effort. Alan then returned to the one vulnerable link he still had access to: Daryl, his daughter, who was in the custody of Child Protective Services due to ongoing court proceedings. Daryl was emotionally fragile and deeply conflicted, yet for months she managed not to reveal the Bellish family's new address, partly because she genuinely did not know it herself. But over time, Alan coaxed bits and pieces from her, small clues that slowly painted a picture, and once he had extracted the information he needed, he abruptly cut contact with her, ignoring her calls completely. Next, Alan used a ruse. He hired a man to deliver flowers to the general area Daryl had described. The delivery man went door to door at several houses, asking for Sheila. At one home, Jamie Bellush opened the door and casually accepted the bouquet, unknowingly confirming the correct address. The deliver flowers called Alan back with the details, unaware he had just become part of something far darker than a flower delivery. 13-year-old Stevie Bellish had never had a peaceful life, but everything reached its breaking point on the afternoon of November 7, 1997. She came home from school excited, ready to tell her mother she had been invited on her very first date. But the moment she reached the front steps, something felt wrong. The door was unlocked. Something Sheila never allowed. Inside, Stevie found her 4 younger siblings behaving strangely, screaming in a way she had never heard before. The children, all toddlers, were naked except for life jackets. It looked as if Sheila had been preparing to bathe them in the pool, a normal routine. But something had interrupted her. Stevie walked through the house calling for her mother, but heard nothing. She noticed what looked like red paint streaking her siblings' skin. But at 13, she still didn't fully grasp what she was seeing. Then she entered the living room and saw belongings scattered everywhere. signs of a violent struggle. In the kitchen, she saw clothes on the floor soaked in red. When she lifted them, her world broke open. Her mother, Sheila, lay beneath the pile. Stevie dialed 911, her voice shaking, and told the dispatcher that her 35-year-old mother was dead and that her throat had been cut. The dispatcher stayed on the line until the first officer arrived. The officer walked Stevie outside, where all 4 toddlers clung to her legs, covered in blood. When asked who could have done this, she answered instantly. She knew only one person who had ever wanted her mother dead: her biological father, Alan Blackthorne. Police soon learned that Sheila owned 20% of Alan's profitable medical equipment business, and that Alan owed her $7 million in court-ordered payments, money he had no intention of giving her. The financial motive was overwhelming, but investigators hit their first roadblock. Alan had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the murder, he was at a golf course in Texas. The medical examiner determined that Sheila had been dead for about 2 hours when Stevie found her. The killer first shot her in the face with a .45 caliber handgun. Little Tim, one of the quadruplets, was believed to have been clinging to her when she was attacked. The bullet entered her cheek, exited the back of her head, and sent her crashing to her knees so hard that bruises formed instantly. But she didn't die right away. Sheila somehow stood back up and staggered toward the wall phone. In the kitchen, bleeding heavily, she managed to dial 911, but never spoke, because the killer grabbed a butcher knife from its stand and slashed her throat repeatedly. Even then, Sheila fought. She had multiple defensive wounds, including one deep enough to expose the bone in her arm. The major veins on both sides of her neck were severed. Despite the severity of the wounds, the medical examiner concluded she could have survived if help had reached her in time. Instead, she collapsed on the kitchen floor while her 4 toddlers crawled through her blood, crying and screaming for a mother who could no longer respond. A single fingerprint was found in the dried blood, but it didn't match Alan's or anyone in the household. A broken, blood-stained knife lay next to her body. The crime was brutal. The scene was chaotic, and the killer had vanished. While questioning neighbors, police located the owner of a landscaping company mowing a yard near the Belush home. The landscaper told officers he had seen a white car he didn't recognize pull up to the house earlier that morning. Inside sat a large, intimidating-looking man. Frightened, the landscaper tried not to stare, but he memorized the license plate. When officers ran the tag, it traced back to a woman in Texas, the grandmother of 21-year-old Jose Del Toro. When detectives questioned Alan Blackthorne, he behaved coolly, even giving interviews to the media. He insisted he had only hit Sheila once in their marriage and called it the worst mistake of his life. As expected, he denied killing her and attempted to blame Daniel Alex Rocha, a friend who owned the golf course he frequented. However, his story quickly unraveled. When police reached Daniel, he revealed something far more disturbing. Alan had hired 27-year-old Samuel Gonzalez, first paying him $9,000. Soon after, Gonzalez brought in his 21-year-old cousin, Jose Del Toro, because Alan didn't want to get his own hands dirty. Jose, once a popular high school football star and prom queen's boyfriend, had long since fallen from grace. By 21, he was deep into banned substances and desperate for money. He had a few minor legal problems in the past, but he wasn't known to be violent. That changed when Blackthorne paid him to kill a woman, claiming she was abusing her children. Alan provided Jose with an old photograph of Sheila holding their daughter, taken during their marriage. Investigators later found this photo among Jose's belongings, but Blackthorne made a critical mistake. He hired a pair of unusually incompetent hitmen. Jose used his real identification to check into a motel near the Belush home. Surveillance footage captured him buying camouflage clothing. During interrogation, he crumbled quickly. Jose admitted sneaking into the garage and watching Sheila with her children, noting she seemed like a loving mother. Completely unlike the monster Alan had described, he claimed he almost backed out. But Alan pressured him relentlessly, insisting Sheila was dangerous, had to be dealt with. Even so, parts of Jose's story conflicted with evidence, making investigators doubt his version of events. Samuel Gonzalez, who introduced Alan to his cousin, Jose Luis del Toro, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in June 1998 and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. Daniel Alex Rocha, 29, acted as the middleman connecting Alan with Samuel Gonzalez, was convicted in January 1999 of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole in February 1999. By the time authorities finally located Jose del Toro, he had already fled to Mexico. With financial help from Rocha, he fought extradition for more than a year. Jose del Toro was extradited to the United States in July 1999, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and armed burglary in 2000 in Florida. Judge Paul Logan sentenced Jose to 2 consecutive life terms, the maximum sentence for both charges. At sentencing, he cried and asked Jamie Bellish for forgiveness, vowing to expose everyone involved in Sheila's murder. There's one more important step left, and that's taking down the man who masterminded the entire affair, Alan Blackthorne. With relentless support from Sheila's sister and a team of attorneys, investigators spent 2 full years building the case. Witness after witness came forward describing Alan's long history of abuse toward Sheila and his previous wives. Searches uncovered alarming evidence. Alan and his new wife, Maureen, had been planning Sheila's murder for months. In their garage, investigators found a wall covered with photographs, notes, and a step-by-step plan. Shockingly, the couple seemed so confident in their impunity that they never bothered to remove any of it. During the investigation, Alan transferred nearly $50 million in assets into Maureen's accounts. Jamie Bellish filed 2 civil suits against them, totaling $38 million, and pursued legal action against others involved in the conspiracy. On January 4, 2000, 44-year-old Alan Blackthorne was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and several related offenses. Because he was considered a flight risk, bail was denied. At trial, his daughters Stevie and Daryl testified against him. Alan never once looked at them, showing no emotion, no acknowledgement, nothing. Prosecutors presented nearly 40 pieces of evidence proving a calculated plot to kill Sheila. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts, Alan Blackthorne was convicted of federal charges of conspiracy to commit interstate murder and interstate domestic violence. He received 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. Beginning at the Beaumont, Texas, federal prison, following his conviction, Alan Blackthorne was transferred to federal prison, where he quickly became a target. Inmates attacked him several times, once stabbing him repeatedly, and in another assault, driving a sharpened screwdriver into his eye. Despite the brutality of these attacks, Alan survived. On November 18, 2014, at the age of 59, he died in federal custody in Terre Haute, Indiana. The official cause of death was never released, even within his own family. Reactions were cold and distant. His wife, Maureen Blackthorne, who had been convicted on financial charges in 2004, filed for divorce the following year. Meanwhile, Jamie Bellish took custody of the quadruplets as well as Stevie, Sheila's daughter from her first marriage, but forgiveness did not come easily. Jamie struggled deeply with resentment toward Daryl, who had once confronted Sheila with allegations of abuse and unwittingly revealed clues about the family's location, information Alan Blackthorne later exploited. Although Daryl had been manipulated as a child and never intended harm, Jamie found it difficult to separate her innocence from the catastrophic consequences that followed. In 2001, after years of legal battles, Alan's remaining assets, roughly $4.5 million, were finally unfrozen and distributed among Sheila's children. It offered financial security but could never replace what they had lost. In the months before her death, Sheila had confided in her sister, asking her to contact writer Anne Rule if the worst ever happened. Honoring that request, her sister reached out. Rule later included Sheila's case in her work, ensuring that her story and the brutality she endured would never be forgotten. Some disappearances begin not with screams, but with silence. A man doesn't come home. A phone call goes unanswered. As time passes, it becomes a threat. In June 2010, Kevin Mengel, a 33-year-old husband and father of 3, disappeared from his life in Chester County, Pennsylvania. He left no note and showed no signs of wanting to leave. He simply vanished. His house was normal, with the lights on and his children's toys scattered about. It was as if life had been paused, but no one knew why. At first, everyone wondered where Kevin had gone. But as time went on, the question changed too. If Kevin didn't leave on his own, who gained the most from his disappearance? The story then shifted from a missing person case to a look at an ordinary family, a failing marriage, and a truth that emerged too late to help anyone. In June 2010, Kevin Mengel, 33 years old, a husband and the father of 3, was reported missing in Chester County, Pennsylvania. At the beginning, the story is small enough to fit inside a kitchen. A man is not home. A phone does not answer. Hours become a full day. Then another. The air changes in the house, not with shouting, but with the kind of silence that makes ordinary objects feel staged. A child's toy was left in the wrong room. A light is still on. The impression of a life paused mid-step. Investigators have to start where police always start. The simplest explanation that can be tested. Adults do leave. Marriages do crack. A missing husband can be a choice or a warning. Early reporting describes that police initially considered the possibility that Kevin had simply left. A theory that can buy time and sometimes costs it. But family instinct is its own kind of evidence. People who know Kevin begin pushing against the walked-away idea. In accounts later told publicly, the pressure from relatives does not fade with the first report. It sharpens. They look harder. They listen for inconsistencies. They keep calling, even when no one picks up. One fact sits immovable beneath every interpretation. 3 children are waiting for a father who does not arrive. The atmosphere is cold with uncertainty, because missing is a word that pretends time is neutral, when time is the one thing a family cannot afford. And the leading question lands without mercy. If Kevin did not leave on his own, then who benefited from his absence right at the moment he vanished? The next chapter follows the life that looked normal from the outside, and the fractures that may have been widening in the dark, long before anyone dialed 911. The verified fact investigators return to first is simple and uncomfortable. Kevin and his wife, Morgan, were not living the marriage their neighbors thought they saw. According to the investigation file and later court records, the relationship was under strain well before Kevin disappeared in June 2010. Financial pressure existed. Trust was fraying, and within the household, stability was no longer guaranteed. From the outside, the Mengels fit a familiar pattern. Young parents, 3 small children, a shared business, a home rooted in routine. But domestic normalcy is often a performance. Behind closed doors, arguments had reportedly intensified. Friends would later tell investigators that the couple had argued about money and fidelity. These details did not surface immediately. They emerged slowly. As police began reconstructing the weeks before Kevin vanished, the atmosphere during this phase of the investigation is restrained but uneasy. Detectives are careful. A missing person case does not yet grant permission to accuse. Morgan, still legally a wife, presents herself as worried, cooperative, and overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility of caring for 3 children alone. On paper, nothing disqualifies her from sympathy, yet absence creates space. and space invites scrutiny. Investigators begin asking procedural questions that feel invasive, but necessary. When was the last argument? Who saw Kevin last? What was said that morning? Morgan's answers are logged, compared, and revisited. Not because they are immediately incriminating, but because consistency matters. And small discrepancies, timing, tone, detail, have a way of expanding under pressure. At the same time, police examine the alternative explanations. Did Kevin have reason to leave voluntarily? Was there another relationship? Was the debt significant enough to run from? Each path is explored, then slowly narrowed. Nothing substantial supports a clean exit. Kevin left behind his children, his belongings, his responsibilities. That fact does not dissolve. The emotional temperature drops further as investigators confront a hard truth. Statistically, when a spouse disappears under unresolved marital conflict, the danger often lives at home. That reality does not accuse. It simply redirects attention. And the leading question becomes unavoidable, pressing against the silence of the house. If the marriage was unraveling, how far had the conflict already gone before Kevin stopped answering his phone? In the next chapter, the investigation drifts outward toward a third presence, entering the orbit of a marriage already under strain. The next verified fact enters the investigation quietly, almost reluctantly. According to court records and later testimony, Morgan was involved in an extramarital relationship at the time of her husband's disappearance. The man's name is Stephen Chappell, an employee connected to the family's landscaping business. His presence does not explode into the case. It seeps in. Affairs, on their own, are not crimes. Investigators know this, but timing is everything. Chappell's connection to Morgan overlaps precisely with the period when the marriage was reportedly deteriorating and Kevin was last seen alive. That overlap changes the geometry of the case. What was once a straight line between husband and wife becomes a triangle. The atmosphere tightens. Interviews take on a sharper edge. Detectives begin mapping proximity, who spoke to whom and when. Phone records become relevant. Work schedules matter. The question is no longer only where Kevin went, but who else may have had a reason for him not to return. According to the investigation file, Morgan initially minimizes the relationship. Chappell is described as a co-worker, a friend, someone offering emotional support during a difficult marriage. Each of those labels may be partially true. None is definitive. But partial truths often function as camouflage. Chappell himself enters the record as cooperative, at least on the surface. He acknowledges knowing Morgan. He denies involvement in Kevin's disappearance. At this stage, there is no physical evidence tying him to a crime. Nobody. No scene. Only association. And association alone is not enough. Still, detectives note the emotional undercurrent. An affair introduces motive into a case that previously lacked focus. Freedom, fear of exposure, the possibility of a future without an obstacle. These are not accusations. They are investigative realities. What unsettles the inquiry most is not the existence of the relationship, but its secrecy. Text messages, later obtained, suggest a private world running parallel to the marriage one Kevin may or may not have known about. Investigators cannot yet prove that the affair played a role in his disappearance, but they can prove it existed. And once a motive appears, every earlier statement must be re-evaluated. The leading question now presses closer to the center. If Kevin stood in the way of a relationship moving forward, did that make him vulnerable? And did anyone act on that vulnerability? The answer does not come from words. It comes from a discovery in an open field that forces the investigation into its next, irreversible phase. The case changes its nature when Kevin is no longer missing. Months after his disappearance, his remains are discovered in a rural field in Chester County. The location is isolated, not remote enough to disappear forever, but distant enough to delay answers. According to official records, the body is identified as Kevin. The confirmation ends one uncertainty and opens many others. This is the first immovable fact of the investigation. Kevin did not leave on his own. He was killed. The atmosphere turns cold and irreversible. Hope, which had lingered unspoken in the background, collapses. For Kevin's family, the discovery delivers both devastation and clarity. Grief now has a shape, And police now have jurisdiction not just over absence, but over death. The condition of the remains limits what forensic science can immediately answer. Time and exposure have erased some details, but investigators are able to determine that the death was not accidental. According to the investigation file, the manner of death is ruled a homicide. How it happened remains under analysis. That gap matters. But motive and opportunity begin to matter more. With a body recovered, the investigation rewinds. Every timeline is replayed. Every statement is reread with different eyes. The focus narrows sharply back to the last known circle around Kevin, his home, his marriage, and the people closest to it. Morgan is no longer just a worried spouse. She is now the last person known to be tied to Kevin's daily life. Stephen Chappell is no longer a peripheral figure. He is now examined as someone who may have had access, opportunity, and a personal stake in Kevin's absence. Detectives revisit phone records and text messages with urgency. What once looked like emotional venting is now evaluated for planning. What once sounded ambiguous is now weighed against a confirmed death. The tone of the investigation shifts from inquiry to pressure. The leading question hardens into something unavoidable. If Kevin was killed, who knew where to take him, where the land was quiet enough and time slow enough to hide a body? The answer does not arrive in the field. It surfaces in short messages, sent in confidence, that begin to contradict grief and expose intent. The next fact enters the case not through soil or bone, but through language. According to court records and evidence later presented, investigators recovered text messages exchanged between Morgan Mengel and Stephen Chappell around the time Kevin disappeared. These messages do not describe confusion. They do not sound like fear. They read with an unsettling calm. Digital evidence has no memory. It preserves tone without context, intention without explanation. And once Kevin's death is confirmed, investigators return to these messages with a colder lens. What once appeared to be emotional reliance now raises sharper questions. Some texts suggest anticipation. Others suggest relief. According to the investigation file, they reference a future that no longer includes Kevin. The atmosphere thickens. Detectives understand that grief usually leaves fingerprints. Panic, repetition, desperation. These messages lack those markers. Instead, they imply coordination. Timing becomes critical. Messages sent before Kevin was reported missing. Messages were sent while his family was still waiting for him to come home. Investigators reconstruct the digital timeline minute by minute. Phones become maps. Cell towers become silent witnesses. They look for overlap moments when Morgan and Chappell's communication aligns with Kevin's last known movements. According to prosecutors, patterns begin to emerge. Not proof on their own, but direction. Morgan is questioned again. This time, with transcripts on the table. She explains the messages as emotional escape, as fantasy, as words spoken under stress. These explanations are logged, but detectives note how often they change. Not dramatically, subtly, enough to matter. Chappell's role sharpens further. His proximity to the family business provided access. His relationship with Morgan provided a motive. His phone records place him within reach of key moments. None of this alone establishes guilt. Together, it tightens the frame. The emotional temperature shifts from suspicion to confrontation. Investigators are no longer asking whether Kevin Mengel is dead. They are asking how his death was discussed before anyone else knew it had happened. The leading question presses with new weight. If these messages were not expressions of grief, then were they traces of planning, and did the words come before the act? The pressure that follows does not stay inside interrogation rooms. It spills into a public moment, where denial meets accusation face to face. The next confirmed moment does not happen behind mirrored glass or inside a courtroom. It happens in daylight, in a parking lot, where grief collides with refusal. According to televised investigative accounts and court records, members of Kevin Mengel's family confront Morgan Mengel directly. By this point, the discovery of Kevin's remains has ended the uncertainty. What remains is denial. The family no longer asks for updates. They ask for truth. The fact is undisputed. The confrontation is recorded and later referenced as a critical, emotional, and psychological pressure point in the case. Morgan is accused openly, not by police, but by those who knew Kevin best. They speak his name. They demand answers. They tell her they believe she knows more than she has said. The atmosphere is tense and exposed. There is no procedural language here, no cautionary script, just a raw accusation in a public space. Morgan does not collapse. She does not confess. She deflects. According to observers, her responses are restrained, defensive, and focused on denial rather than explanation. Investigators watch closely, not because a confrontation proves guilt, but because behavior under pressure reveals structure. Morgan's reactions are later compared to her earlier statements. The gaps widen. Her emotional responses do not align with the timeline investigators are building. Not yet proven, but pattern. Stephen Chappell's presence looms over the exchange, even when he is not physically there. Investigators note that communication between Morgan and Chappell continues after the body is found. According to the investigation file, the messages shift in tone, but not in frequency. That continuity matters. Behind the scenes, detectives are preparing for escalation. They consolidate evidence. They revisit the field. They pressure test alibis. They coordinate interviews with a clearer objective. The case is no longer about what might have happened. It is about what can be proven. The leading question now becomes dangerously narrow. When emotional denial holds under public confrontation, will it hold under legal threat, and who will speak first when the consequences become unavoidable? The answer does not arrive in another argument. It arrives in silence, followed by a decision to plead, rather than explain. The decisive fact arrives without spectacle. Morgan Mengel pleads guilty. According to court records, she admits to first-degree murder and conspiracy in the death of her husband, Kevin Mengel. The plea removes the need for a trial. There will be no jury weighing competing stories, no public reconstruction of every moment. The truth, as defined by the court, is accepted in a single, irreversible act. The atmosphere inside the courtroom is restrained and heavy. Guilty pleas do not provide relief. They provide finality. Morgan does not contest the evidence. She does not force Kevin's family to sit through the testimony. Her admission confirms what investigators had been building toward. Kevin Mengel's death was not an accident, and it was not the work of a stranger. Stephen Chappell follows. He also pleads guilty, according to official sentencing records, to third-degree murder and related charges. His role, as outlined by prosecutors, is that of an accomplice, someone who assisted in carrying out and concealing the crime. He receives a lengthy prison sentence, not life, but decades. The structure of the crime becomes clear in outline, if not in every detail. According to the prosecution, Morgan and Chappell planned Kevin's killing together. The motive is not framed as rage in the moment, but as removal, a future imagined without interference. Kevin is reduced, in that planning, to an obstacle. The emotional temperature shifts again, this time toward quiet devastation. There is no catharsis in a guilty plea. For Kevin's parents, siblings, and friends, the admission confirms the worst conclusion. The danger did not come from outside the home. It lived inside it. Morgan Mengel is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as mandated by law for first-degree murder. The sentence is procedural. The impact is permanent. The leading question lingers, unresolved in any legal document. When guilt is finally acknowledged, does it explain the violence or only prove that trust was fatally misplaced? The case, however, does not end with sentencing. Its consequences ripple outward, toward the children left behind, and toward the systems that failed to see the danger sooner. On September 20, 2017, 19-year-old Corinna Slusser called her mother, Sabina Tuordo. Corinna was in Queens, New York. She said she wanted to go home. She explained that her driver's license and social security card were missing. Both had been stolen. Without those documents, she couldn't buy a plane ticket. So she said she would try to take a train instead. Her voice shook, as if she was afraid or hiding something she couldn't bring herself to say. Sabina, who was in Florida for her father's funeral at the time, told her daughter to stay inside, stay safe, and wait for help. That phone call would be the last conversation she ever had with Corinna. Investigators later discovered that later that same night, Corinna messaged a man named Giovanni Peguero, asking for a place to stay and help getting out of New York. He didn't respond until hours later, and by then Corinna was no longer picking up her phone. After that night, Corinna Slusser vanished without a trace. Corinna Page Slusser was born on June 10, 1998, in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. After her parents divorced, she was raised by her mother, Sabina Tuorto. Corinna was outgoing, involved in school activities, and performed well academically. In high school, she was a cheerleader who loved makeup, fashion, and posting photos on Instagram. Friends remembered her as cheerful, approachable, ambitious. She dreamed of becoming a makeup artist, but signs of trouble appeared in 2016. She began spending time with a new group of friends, skipping classes, and slipping academically. Her behavior shifted. She became irritable, distant, unpredictable. Sabina noticed Corinna returning home late, sometimes not at all, and appearing with expensive items she had no way of paying for. That year, she was arrested for petty theft. By spring 2017, Corinna was in a deep emotional crisis. In April, she attempted self-harm and was hospitalized. After being released, she moved to Hazleton to live with a friend, hoping for a fresh start. She found work as a server at a casual dining restaurant, likely an Applebee's or something similar. At first, things seemed stable. She lived with her friend, earned enough to support herself. But soon, Corinna developed a desire for quick money and a luxurious lifestyle. Friends later revealed she began meeting older men who gave her gifts, cash, help with housing. She first referred to herself as a sugar baby. Her spending habits spiraled. She argues with her friend, sometimes she can contact her, sometimes she can't. Sabina tried to warn her about the dangers of the path she was heading down, but Corinna responded with hostility and anger on Instagram. She continued to present a flawless image using filters, bold makeup. Behind the posts, her real life was becoming unstable. Short-term stays, unknown apartments, and cheap motels. By summer 2017, Corinna was extremely vulnerable. Financial instability, fractured relationships, and her reliance on men she met online created the perfect conditions for being exploited. It was during this period that she first connected with Giovanni Pagero, a man who promised her a new beginning in New York City. On August 19, 2017, Corinna arrived in New York with Pagero, the same man she had been messaging, bringing only her cell phone and identification. She didn't even bring spare clothes. Pagero was older, confident, portrayed himself as someone who could provide stability. On her first day, he took her to the Harlem Vista Hotel and paid for several nights. He told her it was temporary until he found her permanent housing and work. Corinna accepted this. She was alone in a new city and relied on his guidance. She had no way of knowing she had just stepped into the center of a dangerous world, one she would never escape. The first 2 days in New York seemed manageable under his guidance. Pagero brought Corinna food, accompanied her to pharmacies and shops, gradually began telling her whom she could and couldn't talk to. He monitored her phone calls. Her personal documents eventually ended up in his possession, supposedly so he could help her get an apartment. He read her messages, criticized her photos, and commented on her interactions with other men. Corinna didn't immediately realize that her fresh start was turning into dangerous dependence. By August 21, the first arguments had erupted. Pagero became irritated by her messages, accused her of disappointing him, and demanded that she behave properly. She was only allowed to leave the hotel if he accompanied her. He refused to let her be alone for more than a few minutes. He blocked her friends' numbers, spoke negatively about her mother, and insisted that everyone outside of him was using her. Bit by bit, Corinna became cut off from the outside world. At 1 a.m., on August 25, Slusser called 911 from the Harlem Vista Hotel in Manhattan and said that Giovanni Pagero, a man she identified as her pimp and called Dad, had stolen $300 from her. When she confronted him, he grabbed her by the neck, choked her, and slammed her against a wall. When police arrived, she was still very shaken, trembling, and crying. Giovanni Pagero was arrested and charged with harassment, third-degree assault, and obstructing breathing or blood circulation. The court issued a temporary protective order against him on behalf of Corinna Slusser. When her family in Pennsylvania learned of the attack, she downplayed it and told them there was nothing to worry about. After his arrest, Corinna was completely isolated. She had no identification, no money, and no support system. The hotel room had only been paid for a few more days, and soon she had to leave. To friends, she pretended she was fine, that she had things under control. But in reality, her situation kept spiraling. Without her documents, she couldn't work, rent a room, or apply for assistance. Corinna stayed in New York because she felt she wasn't capable of returning home. Her relationship with her mother was broken, and she didn't want to admit that she was struggling. Instead, she turned to the internet for help, staying in the apartments of men she met online. They offered temporary shelter or assistance, but in exchange expected her attention, or what they called intimate. This kind of help was neither safe nor stable, and only increased her vulnerability. Some of the men she communicated with shared her information with others, requested adult photos, even suggested posting ads for her online. By early September 2017, her images began appearing on escort websites. The photos were cropped, filtered, and paired with rotating phone numbers. Her friends recognized her immediately. Whether she agreed or not remains unknown, but the process of pulling her into exploitation had begun. It was around this time that Ishiwani reached out to her. He already knew Peguero and operated in similar circles. Woni approached Corinna as someone offering help, promising safety, housing, and a fresh start. He convinced her to move into the Haven Motel in Queens. It was presented as temporary, but in reality, it was the first step in establishing full control. Within days at the Haven Motel, Woni began posting ads online using Corinna's photos. He set the prices, wrote the descriptions, and controlled all communication. Corinna was ordered to follow his rules. Their messages revealed total domination. Woni demanded constant updates, insisted on obedience, and spoke as if she belonged to him. Her movements were restricted. He monitored her phone constantly. Any independence she had left was disappearing. Other girls lived at the motel too. Tension between them grew. They competed for attention, clients, and control. Corinna, pressured from all sides, sometimes tried to act independently, but she backed down quickly. She had nowhere else to go. What had begun as a promise of help had turned into complete loss of freedom, her life controlled by someone else, her choices dictated, her identity taken. By the time she disappeared, she was already deeply trapped. September 20, 2017, was the last day Corinna Slusser was seen in public. Witnesses and motel surveillance confirmed that she walked out of the Haven Motel that morning. From that moment on, she vanished. When Corinna stopped replying to messages, no one immediately realized she was missing. Her chaotic lifestyle had conditioned people around her to expect silence. Friends assumed she had changed her number again. Her mother thought she was upset. Days passed before anyone understood that something far more serious had happened. Sabina returned from Florida at the end of September and immediately sensed something was wrong. Her home felt unusually quiet. Corinna wasn't answering calls or messages, and all of her belongings, the things she had left behind when she moved to New York, were untouched. That was when Sabina contacted the Bloomsburg Police Department. At first, the case was recorded as a voluntary disappearance. But when Sabina provided a copy of the protective order previously issued against Giovanni Peguero, along with letters he had sent from jail after his August arrest, authorities realized this was no ordinary missing person case. The investigation was transferred to New York. Detectives began tracing Corinna's digital and financial footprint. One of the first leads took them directly to the Haven Motel in Queens. The manager confirmed that a young woman matching Corinna's description had stayed there in September with a man who paid only in cash and behaved like her handler. She rarely spoke and always looked exhausted. She was last seen on the 20th. After that, the room sat empty for 2 days before housekeeping entered. Inside, detectives found scattered personal items, makeup, a pharmacy receipt, and an empty purse. But the essentials were gone: phone, ID documents, clothing. The room had been rented under a false name, and payments were traced to Ishiwani's debit card. When questioned, Wani insisted that Corinna had left voluntarily and denied knowing where she went next. He claimed she had been planning to meet someone in the Bronx. By then, his phone had been wiped clean and the SIM card replaced. A digital forensic review revealed that in the week before her disappearance, Corinna had accessed escort service websites repeatedly. Though her listings had been deleted, cached versions of the ads were recovered. They featured edited photos of her and had been posted from IP addresses in the Bronx and Queens, the same locations used by Woni's exploitation network. Investigators also found that several profiles posting the ads shared similar writing patterns and formatting, indicating they were controlled by the same group. As the investigation expanded, authorities uncovered individuals connected to Woni, who confirmed that Corinna had been working within their group for a time before she was taken over by another man. That man's description matched Piguero. This was the first direct confirmation that both men were part of the same trafficking circuit. Despite these findings, evidence was still thin. Corinna was legally an adult, and there were no official reports of abuse filed in New York. By late November 2017, detectives feared she may no longer be in the city. They reviewed bus, train, and airport footage, but found nothing. Her final phone ping came from the Bronx late on September 20. After that, her device went dark forever. The investigation hit a wall. Reports kept circling the same three names: Corinna Slusser, Giovanni Piguero, and Ishi Woni. Everything pointed to her last day. Beyond that, there were possibilities: voluntary disappearance, harm, or relocation within a trafficking network. None could be proven. Sabina Torto refused to let the case fade. She became relentless, determined that people would remember her daughter was not just another missing person statistic. She began with social media posts, messages to journalists, and persistent calls to police. Her efforts were met with polite but ineffective responses. The investigation was active, they said, yet nothing seemed to move. Sabina watched helplessly as her daughter's case slid towards silence. She began reaching out to anyone who would listen, including online communities dedicated to missing persons cases. Corinna's photos soon appeared on New York-based forums and even in public Craigslist groups. Sabina searched every listing herself, scrolling for hours, looking for any face that resembled her daughter. Sometimes she thought she recognized Corinna, different hairstyles, different makeup, different angles. Each time, she forwarded the lead to investigators, who assured her they would check it out. By November 2017, Sabina realized quiet persistence was no longer enough. The case needed attention, loud, public attention. So she went to the media, speaking with local Pennsylvania stations and sharing details about Ishi Woni's August arrest and Corinna's last confirmed day at the Haven Motel. It was the turning point. The story spread across social media. Suddenly, strangers were contacting Sabina with sightings. Someone claimed they saw Corinna on the subway. Another reported a girl resembling her in Atlantic City. Another said they rode the same bus. Some leads were vague, others detailed. Sabina sent every single one to authorities. People started paying attention to the case. Determined to keep the momentum, Sabina launched Help Find Corinna Slusser on Facebook and started raising funds for a reward. Within weeks, thousands followed the page. Volunteers designed posters, created digital flyers, and circulated Corinna's story across multiple platforms. Sabina traveled to New York, plastering Corinna's photo on street poles, bus stops, laundromats, convenience stores, anywhere someone might look. At one point, she received a police citation for posting without permission. She simply told the reporter that as long as people could see Corinna's face. Meanwhile, a legal battle was forming. Sabina hired an attorney and pushed for Corinna's case to be included in a federal anti-trafficking initiative. She succeeded. The classification changed from a voluntary departure to a high-risk missing person case with suspected exploitation. Everything shifted. Homeland Security got involved. Federal agents began investigating Ishi Woni's network, searching for other victims and mapping out digital trails that connected multiple traffickers operating across Queens and the Bronx. In a letter to the district attorney, Sabina wrote that her daughter was not gone and that she had disappeared into a system the district attorney was too afraid to name. She demanded that the district attorney bring her daughter back to her, alive or not. That letter was later quoted on cable news network. National media finally paid attention. In December 2017, the FBI added Corinna's name to the national database and issued a $10,000 reward. Overnight, her case spread across the country. Sabina was overwhelmed. Corinna's face was everywhere, but the one person who mattered most still couldn't be reached. The increased pressure forced investigators to question Wani again. He denied everything. His lawyer insisted Corinna was an adult making her own choices. He repeated the same lines. He last saw her on September 20. She left on her own. He was not responsible. Then came a breakthrough. A former acquaintance of Wani, a young woman who had once stayed at the same motel, contacted Sabina and her attorney. She described manipulation, fear, surveillance, and rules no one could break without violence or threats. She explained how Wani kept the girls in constant debt, controlled their phones, dictated when they could speak, sleep, or leave a room. This was the first direct confirmation that Corinna had not been acting freely. Sabina never stopped searching. She visited women's shelters, met with staff at crisis centers, showed Corinna's photos to social workers and outreach teams. She left her number everywhere. By January 2018, other mothers began contacting her. Their daughters had also disappeared. Same age, same circumstances, same cities. The stories followed the same pattern. Online connection, promise of opportunity, trip to New York, then silence. Sabina realized something devastating. Corinna's case wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a much larger pattern. She began speaking publicly at community meetings, partnering with anti-trafficking groups, warning families that vulnerability didn't always look the way people assumed. It can happen to any daughter, in any home. By then, Sabina understood the possible outcomes. Corinna might have been taken, harmed, transported out of state, or she might still be alive somewhere, terrified and unable to reach out. But as long as no body was found, there was still hope, and Sabina fought to keep that hope alive, not only for herself but for everyone around her. Meanwhile, investigators continued gathering everything they could, tracking down anyone connected to Corinna, every online account used in her ads, and every IP address associated with her digital trail. Yet, no decisive breakthrough emerged. Corinna had vanished in a city where countless people simply disappear. The clues were scattered and inconsistent. Witness statements conflicted, timelines overlapped, and nothing was strong enough to support formal charges. Sabina refused to wait in silence. She documented everything. Every voicemail, every message, every conversation. Piece by piece, she created a complete timeline of her daughter's final weeks. That timeline eventually became the backbone of a public database, mapping Corinna's disappearance nearly hour by hour. It was Sabina's relentless dedication that kept the case alive when public attention drifted away. She reminded people that her voice had become the last one speaking for a daughter no one else could hear anymore. When Corinna Slusser's case finally went federal, the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York took over. Their working theory was that Corinna's disappearance was tied to intimate trafficking. This classification unlocked a wider range of investigative tools, from telecom subpoenas to access to restricted advertising platforms known to host illicit listings. Agents began examining her digital footprint using IP logs and phone number tracing. They uncovered dozens of online ads featuring Corinna's photos. Shockingly, some of these listings were posted in October and November 2017, weeks after she had already gone missing. The ads didn't list her name, but the images were unmistakable. Same angles, same outfits, same facial marks. The phone numbers tied to those ads shifted constantly. Some had been flagged in earlier trafficking cases. Many were masked using call forwarding services. Several were registered under false identities, women previously associated with Ishi Woni. This allowed agents to expand the list of potential accomplices and revealed that Woni's operation was organized and far-reaching, not the work of a single individual. The scheme involved fake ads, the use of proxies, renting housing under forged documents. Search warrants were issued for digital devices belonging to Woni and his known associates. The data recovered from seized smartphones provided critical evidence, including photos of Corinna Slusser, encrypted chats with clients, and audio messages containing direct orders and threats. Investigators also uncovered group chats, discussing prices, meeting locations, the frequency of encounters. One phrase, "she can't say no," appeared in several messages. When combined with statements from other victims, the evidence confirmed that Corinna had been controlled, threatened, and coerced. FBI interviews with other women connected to Woni produced mixed but illuminating accounts. Some were terrified and refused to talk. Others admitted they had escaped earlier. Several said they had heard Woni mention Corinna by name. A few said they had seen her photo saved in his phone. They explained that Woni often rotated ads among the girls, using images of whoever he chose to advertise that day. This could explain why Corinna's photos appeared online for months after she disappeared. At the same time, investigators tracked transportation activity and reviewed surveillance footage around Queens and the Bronx that placed Woni near the Haven Motel. The analysis showed that on the day Corinna disappeared, Woni was seen leaving the motel alone, carrying no bags or personal items. Despite his repeated claims that he didn't know where she went, the timeline of his actions told a different story. Law enforcement obtained motel entry logs and call records, which confirmed that after September 20, Woni continued using Corinna's phone number. This detail directly contradicted his account and strengthened suspicions that he was withholding information. Federal prosecutors began building a case for formal charges. The primary focus was human trafficking under aggravated circumstances, including coercion, threats, and the involvement of a minor, as well as participation in an organized operation. Corinna was 19 when she first met Woni. Authorities were also investigating other women connected to Woni, aiming to establish a broader pattern of exploitation that could support additional charges. Even without a recovered body, the search for Corinna expanded to every location linked to Woni: motels he had rented, apartments he frequented, and transportation hubs he routinely used. Despite multiple raids, investigators found little direct evidence tied to Corinna. However, during one operation, they recovered belongings belonging to another young woman. She later came forward and alleged that she had also been abused by Woni. Her testimony strengthened the investigation and supported a broader federal indictment by the spring of 2018. The case then entered a new phase. Authorities formed an international search initiative, fearing Corinna might have been transported out of the country, to Canada, the Dominican Republic, or elsewhere. Requests were sent through Interpol, but none of her biometric data matched border records. At this point, investigators were left with two grim possibilities. Either Corinna was no longer alive, or she was being held somewhere in the United States, completely cut off from the outside world. The FBI continued expanding the pool of suspects. At least 6 individuals connected to Woni and the online ads were officially named. Yet none of them could confirm seeing Corinna after September 20, and none could provide credible information about her fate. The investigation hit a familiar and deeply frustrating barrier: no body, no eyewitness, no definitive trail. Still, the evidence, gigabytes of digital data, testimony from multiple women, and extensive online footprints painted a compelling picture. Everything suggested that Corinna's disappearance was part of a larger criminal network, not a voluntary departure. Her case became a stark demonstration of the dangers young people face in the digital age, how someone can vanish within weeks, slipping into the shadows despite a nationwide effort to find her. By 2022, the federal investigation into the disappearance of Corinna Slusser had officially concluded. The evidence collected over several years was enough to bring charges against Woni, who was found guilty of intimate trafficking and exploitation. At least 6 young women were confirmed as victims of his abuses. Although Corinna was not the central figure in the indictment, her disappearance loomed over the case, with numerous pieces of evidence suggesting Woni's possible involvement. The U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York sentenced Woni to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, and ordered him to pay restitution to several of the exploited women. The sentencing marked a rare moment in trafficking cases, an offender receiving a significant prison sentence even without a recovered body or direct physical evidence linking him to a missing person. Meanwhile, attention also returned to Giovanni Pagero. His arrest on August 25, 2017, remained the only legal action ever taken against him. He was never formally charged in connection with Corinna's disappearance. Despite being the one who initially brought her to New York, the turning point that led to her exploitation, he was not named as a suspect in the federal case. In court, Corinna's name appeared not as a witness or defendant, but as a symbol, a young woman who vanished somewhere between the internet, the streets, and a system that acted far too slowly. Her case forced a shift in how law enforcement approaches digital exploitation and the targeting of vulnerable young women. But for her mother, no legal victory could ease the pain. Corinna's body was never found, and her disappearance remains officially unsolved. Today, nearly a decade after she vanished, the story of Corinna Page Slusser remains one of the most haunting unresolved cases in modern trafficking investigations. A bright, ambitious teenager from Pennsylvania, someone who once dreamed of doing makeup and building a future, was slowly pulled into a world designed to erase people like her. To this day, Sabina still waits. Without a body, there is no closure. All she can hold on to is hope, the fragile, stubborn hope that somewhere, someone still knows the truth about what happened on that September morning. Amy Billig was born on January 9, 1957, in Oyster Bay, New York City. Her parents, Ned Solomon and Susan Billig, had endured several miscarriages before her birth, making her their miracle child. A year later, on February 14, 1958, they welcomed their son, Josh. When Amy was 11 and Josh was 10, the family moved from New York to South Florida because of concerns about the city's high crime rate. They attended private schools, while their parents ran an art studio near Commodore Plaza. Amy is a gentle, friendly girl who embodies the free spirit of the 1970s. She loved music, played the flute, guitar, and often sang, and was a devout Jew. Amy loved to read, write, and often jotted down poems in her notebook. She loved animals, was a vegetarian, and dreamed of becoming an actress. She often hitchhiked, a common and generally accepted practice at the time. By early 1974, Amy was preparing to graduate from Adelphi Academy of Coral Gables on March 31, looking forward to pursuing her acting dream. But weeks before graduation, she disappeared without a trace, leaving her Coconut Grove community in shock. On Tuesday, March 5, 1974, Amy came home from school and made plans to meet friends later that day, plans she would never keep. She called her father's art studio to ask for money for lunch at Peacock Park. Her father, Ned, agreed, and she began walking to the store, less than a mile away. Dressed in a denim skirt, cork platform shoes, and carrying her camera, she chose to hitchhike there, something considered normal back then. She never arrived. When Amy didn't come home that evening, her mother Susan and younger brother Josh became worried. When her father said she had never been to the store, their concern turned to fear. Susan called Amy's friends and was alarmed to learn Amy had never met them for lunch. The family contacted the police, who initially told her not to worry and to call back if Amy didn't return by morning. By 6:00 a.m. the next day, March 6, Susan called the police again in panic, and an official search began. Investigators canvassed the area and soon discovered a possible lead. Witnesses reported seeing Amy getting into a white van near Coconut Grove that afternoon. On March 18, 13 days after Amy vanished, a college student hitchhiking near the Wildwood exit of Florida's Turnpike, about 250 miles from Miami, found her camera discarded in the grass. The camera was returned to the police, and the family confirmed it belonged to Amy. After developing the film, investigators found most photos unusable. But two caught their attention. They showed a light-colored, possibly white pickup truck parked in front of a house covered in vines. This matched witness accounts of Amy entering a white van the day she disappeared. However, detectives couldn't verify when or where the photos were taken. With no address, license plate, or other identifying details, the trail went cold. Desperate to find out the truth, Amy's mother, Susan, urged the police to search her daughter's room for fingerprints. believing that the kidnapper might be someone Amy knew. Initially, the police dismissed the idea, assuming that Amy had simply run away. But as time went on, it became clear she hadn't left on her own. Someone had likely taken her. When the police finally agreed to check Amy's room for fingerprints, all traces had been wiped away by the hot, humid Florida weather. It was a serious mistake and a lost chance to uncover vital clues about Amy's disappearance. Refusing to lose hope, Susan started her own investigation and hired a private detective. She and her husband, Ned, worked to spread the word, doing everything they could to let people know Amy was missing. They created posters in English and Spanish, organized a vigil in Amy's honor, and went door to door asking neighbors for any information. Susan also called the Miami Police Department almost every day for updates. In quiet moments, she would sit in Amy's room, filled with longing and trying to feel close to her daughter. One day, while in Amy's room, Susan happened to flip through her daughter's notebook and made a disturbing discovery. In an entry written 6 weeks before disappearing, Amy mentioned that she and a boy named Hank planned to go to South America, a plan she described as crazy. The revelation deeply unsettled Susan. Amy had always been open with her family, especially with her mother, sharing almost everything. So why had she never mentioned Hank or this strange plan to travel abroad? The silence was all the more ominous, and it would later become a key part of the case. 16 days after Amy vanished, Susan received a chilling call from twin brothers, Charles and Lawrence Glasser, both 16 years old. They claimed to be holding Amy hostage and demanded $30,000 in ransom. Police tracked down Charles and Lawrence and arrested them on March 22 at the Fontainebleau Hotel. Susan hoped this would be a breakthrough that would reunite her with Amy. But it turned out to be a hoax. They had never kidnapped Amy. Both Charles and Lawrence were charged with extortion and pleaded guilty. After that incident, Susan continued to receive false calls and tips, but she clung to every little clue. Yet some leads seemed believable. Many suggested that Amy had been kidnapped by a biker gang, possibly the Outlaws or the Pagans, both with reputations for abducting women. Witnesses even claimed to have seen Amy riding on the back of a motorcycle with a gang member on the day she disappeared. This theory gained traction. In the 1970s, the Outlaws and the Pagans were active in Coconut Grove, and people feared Amy had been taken by one of them. Following these leads, Susan eventually traveled to a convenience store near Orlando. When shown Amy's picture, the manager immediately recognized her. A girl matching Amy's description entered the store with 2 men who looked like motorcyclists and bought a can of vegetable soup, a detail that caught Susan's attention because Amy was a vegetarian. The manager added that the girl barely spoke, and the men referred to her as mute, sometimes calling her Mellow Cheryl. This deepened Susan's belief in the biker gang theory. Determined to find the truth, she began speaking directly with gang members, searching for any hint that could lead her to Amy. In January 1976, a former biker named Paul approached Susan, claiming he had information about her daughter. He invited her to his home, where he admitted that during his time in the gang, he had owned Amy. Paul described her as quiet, submissive, and nearly mute, just as others had said. According to him, Amy was still alive but held captive by the gang. Susan was skeptical, so she asked Paul to describe something unique about Amy's appearance. His answer shocked her. He accurately mentioned a scar on Amy's stomach, a detail only Susan knew and had never shared publicly. The revelation convinced her that Paul was telling the truth. Soon after, he called again, claiming that Amy was being held at a violent biker bar in Tulsa, a notoriously dangerous place. Despite the danger, Susan was ready to do anything to rescue her daughter. When she met Paul at the bar, chaos broke out. Before she knew what was happening, another cyclist escorted her out and put her in a waiting taxi to take her back to the hotel. Soon after, Paul contacted Susan again through her lawyer. This time, He claimed that Amy was in Seattle. Despite recently suffering a heart attack, Susan refused to rest. She immediately traveled there, determined to continue searching for her daughter. Unfortunately, all her efforts were in vain. The young girls she met were not Amy. It was never clear whether these tips were real leads or deliberate attempts to torment Susan. There's still the possibility that Amy was kidnapped by a biker gang, and Paul may have genuinely been trying to help Susan with the little information he had. Then, in late 1992, Susan was approached by Virginia Schneider, a private investigator working on a different case. Schneider had been collaborating with a detective in England who shared a curious report. A heavily tattooed man, looking like a biker, had been seen at a post office in Falmouth, England, with a young woman. When asked about her, he said she was a deaf American from Oyster Bay. This caught Susan's attention. As Amy had been born in Oyster Bay, it was striking that every claimed sighting described the young woman the same way. Unfortunately, after a year, this lead went cold when the English investigator passed away, leaving no further information about Amy's whereabouts. In the following years, disturbing details began to surface. In 1997, Paul's wife told police that before his death, Paul had confessed the truth: the biker gang was responsible for Amy's disappearance, and according to him, they had killed her. Paul reportedly admitted that Amy was abused by some biker gangs at a pagan gang party in the Everglades. She had resisted and cursed at them. The gang hadn't originally planned to kill her, but when she continued to fight back, they reportedly drugged her to force compliance. This banned substance accidentally caused an overdose, leading to death. According to Paul, the bikers disposed of Amy's body in a nearby swamp filled with snakes, explaining why she was never found. However, it is also possible that this entire story was fabricated and that Paul's wife was seeking attention from the media. For Susan, hearing such claims was devastating. Each new revelation only deepened her pain, but she refused to give up hope that Amy might still be alive. Just a few months after Amy disappeared, while Susan was delving into the dangerous world of biker gangs searching for her daughter, she began receiving disturbing phone calls. Sometimes there was only silence. Other times, she heard nothing but a man's heavy breathing. Police were never able to identify who was calling. Most of the calls came from scattered payphones, and without security cameras nearby, tracking the caller was nearly impossible. Investigators could only narrow down the general locations, but the caller always stayed a step ahead, switching to different payphones to avoid being caught. It seemed he knew about the surveillance and was deliberately playing a cruel game. For nearly 21 years, he relentlessly harassed Susan. Sometimes he would call 7 or 8 times a day, while other times months would go by without a sound, making the torment unpredictable and constant. The experience was terrifying and emotionally draining for Susan. Susan lived in constant anguish, burdened by the endless search for her daughter over 2 decades. The mental and emotional toll was unimaginable. For years, she chased countless false leads, each ending in heartbreak and frustration. Then, in 1993, a glimmer of hope appeared. The caller began using a cell phone, which allowed the FBI to trace the calls. On November 17, 1995, a 48-year-old man named Henry Johnson Blair was arrested. Investigators discovered that Henry had been tormenting Susan with disturbing calls for nearly 21 years. Henry, born in 1947, was married with 2 daughters. He struggled with obsessive-compulsive disorder and alcohol addiction and worked for 24 years at the U.S. Customs Service. But was Amy ever with him? Did Susan finally learn the truth about her daughter? Sadly, no. Henry confessed that he had never met Amy and had made the calls for his own twisted amusement. He admitted to harassing other families of missing persons as well, blaming his behavior on OCD and alcoholism. His excuses offered no comfort or closure for Susan after decades of suffering. His explanation didn't make sense. Mental illness and drinking problems cannot justify terrorizing a grieving mother with cruel claims about her missing child, especially for 21 years. Something about his story never felt right. Then, new and unsettling details emerged. Amy's diary mentioned going to South America with someone named Hank. Henry's nickname also happened to be Hank. Even more disturbingly, Henry had been sent to South America for work at the same time Amy wrote that diary entry. To many, this coincidence seemed impossible to ignore. The link between Amy's Hank and Henry Hank Blair felt more than coincidental. One of Amy's photos showed a white pickup truck, strikingly similar to the one Henry drove at the time. Another eerie detail that fueled suspicion: Henry appeared to be the prime suspect. Could Amy have known him? Had she left behind a clue no one had yet understood? Despite these connections, no direct evidence ever tied Henry to Amy's disappearance. He was charged only with aggravated stalking and served 2 years in prison. After enduring years of torment, Susan sued Henry and eventually reached a $5 million settlement. The bizarre coincidences surrounding Henry and his possible connection to Amy remain haunting. While no proof links him to Amy's disappearance, the overlap between his life and hers is difficult to dismiss. Nothing definitively shows that Henry abducted Amy. But the timing of his South American work trip, Amy's diary entry about going there with Hank, and the photo of the white truck seem too closely aligned to be random. It's entirely possible that Henry and Amy had crossed paths before, perhaps forming a relationship that evolved into a dangerous obsession, explaining why Henry tormented Susan for so many years after Amy vanished. The theory involving a biker gang was always speculation. But Amy's diary entry and the troubling details about Henry stand out as unusual. Henry never explained the white truck seen in photos or Amy's mention of someone named Hank in her diary. Henry died in Florida in 2006 at the age of 59, leaving Susan with no news from Amy and only vague clues. Was Amy still alive somewhere? Possibly held by a biker gang? Did something tragic happen to her in the Everglades? Or did Henry, also known as Hank, somehow evade serious consequences, keeping the truth about Amy's disappearance, and perhaps her death, a secret forever? None of these questions have ever been definitively answered. Amy's diary entry is a key element in the mystery, impossible to overlook, and suspicion about Henry still lingers. Even after more than 30 years, Susan never stopped searching for her daughter. She pursued every possible lead and worked relentlessly to keep Amy's case active and her memory alive. A Facebook page dedicated to Amy Billig was later created, giving Susan another way to hold on to hope that Amy might one day come home. Sadly, Susan passed away from a heart attack on June 7, 2005, at the age of 80, never seeing that hope fulfilled. Throughout her search, she remained a symbol of determination, a mother willing to face any danger to bring her daughter back. She never found peace or closure. Amy's younger brother, Josh, a stonemason, continues to update the Facebook page, honoring their mother's devotion and keeping hope alive that Amy might still be found. The search for Amy has never truly ended. Every clue her family follows seems to lead back to the starting point, bringing a moment of hope but always followed by disappointment. To this day, Amy's fate remains a mystery, deepening the sadness surrounding her story. All anyone can do now is hope that she has found peace, wherever she may be. On the morning of November 24, 1987, on the deserted Parson Creek Road in Skagit County, Washington, a truck driver stopped on the side of the road and discovered a scene that stunned him. Amidst the rotting leaves and mud, the body of a young woman lay discarded like trash, clothes disheveled, hands bound with duct tape, a bullet through her head. 2 days later, more than 60 miles away, under the High Bridge in Snohomish County, Police were shocked to find the body of a young man strangled with rope. Covered with an old blanket, there were no cameras, no witnesses, just a few strands of hair, traces of semen, and a torn ferry ticket in the abandoned van in Bellingham. For more than 3 decades, police had followed every lead, but nothing had come up. It wasn't until DNA genealogy technology was used to build a family tree from the killer's DNA that a name suddenly emerged: William Earl Talbot. The case not only ended a tragedy, but also ushered in a new era of justice, where time may fade, but DNA never forgets. Tanja van Cuylenborg was born on March 7, 1969, in Victoria, Canada. She grew up with loving parents and was very close to her older brother. From a young age, she adored animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. She also wanted to travel the world. A high school trip to Paris with her best friend strengthened that dream. At 18, shortly before graduating, Tanja met Jay Cook, who was 2 years older and had attended the same school. They were introduced by a mutual friend after Jay graduated and soon began dating. Although Tanja still hoped to study veterinary medicine, she chose to delay college to travel. After graduation, she worked at a cafe to save money and also took a job walking dogs. Jay didn't go to college either. He worked with his father, who ran a small heating installation business. In November 1987, Jay's father received an order, but couldn't find a key part locally. The nearest supplier was in Seattle, Washington. Instead of placing a delivery order, he wanted to go buy it himself for speed and lower cost. But since he was busy, he asked Jay to go in his place. Jay agreed and invited Tanja to come along, hoping the trip would bond them. They had been dating for about 6 months, and Tanja happily accepted. The plan was simple: leave Victoria in the morning, arrive in Seattle by evening, and return the next day. Jay's father lent them his van and gave money for a hotel, but Jay and Tanja decided to save the hotel money and sleep in the van. He also gave Jay a $700 check for the part and additional cash for expenses. Even though Seattle isn't far from Victoria, the route required 2 ferries, one to enter the U.S. and another to cross the bay near Seattle. On the morning of November 18, they left for the first ferry to Port Angeles. Their parents expected them home the following afternoon, but Tanja and Jay never returned. Knowing the ferry schedule, the 2 families were worried because they should have arrived home by now, but they were nowhere to be found. At first, the parents considered that they might have stopped to sightsee and missed the ferry. As more time passed with no word, Tanja's parents called Jay's parents. By afternoon, both families feared something was wrong. They still hoped Tanja and Jay were simply extending their trip, but their worries grew. When they still had not returned by the end of the day, their parents went to the police the next morning to report them missing. The police declined to launch a search, noting that Tanja was 18 and Jay was 20, and there was no evidence of foul play. They suggested waiting a few more days, assuming Tanja and Jay left on their own. The families were frustrated and disagreed, but the police refused to act. By then, both families were certain Tanja and Jay wouldn't have extended the trip without calling. Jay had an important task for his father's business and wasn't irresponsible. And if plans had changed, they could have called from any of the many payphones along the route. Tanja's father decided to search on his own. He and Jay's parents confirmed that Jay had never gone to pick up the parts in Seattle. The supplier said they had waited for several hours, but no one showed up. Tanja's father drove the entire route to Seattle, but found no trace of Tanja, Jay, or their truck. Not giving up, he hired a private helicopter to fly along their planned route. However, the aerial search was also hopeless because the area was mostly forested, making it difficult to observe. He then made missing person flyers and spent several days posting them around Seattle. The families pressed relentlessly for action, and the local police finally took the case more seriously. though they still suspected Tanya and Jay were simply off together and would return. Therefore, they only contacted the Seattle police, provided a description of the truck and information about Tanya and Jay, and asked to be notified if there were any findings. On November 24, 5 days after the disappearance, a man walking near a wooded embankment about 90 miles north of Seattle saw something unusual under a tree. On closer inspection, he realized it was a body and called police. Officers found the body of a young woman. Her clothing was partially missing. Her hands were bound, and she had a gunshot wound to the head. The lack of blood at the scene indicated she had been killed elsewhere. The victim had no identification, so police checked it against a list of missing women in the area. They quickly found the victim matched Tanya van Cuylenborg's description and contacted her father. He went to the morgue and confirmed it was his daughter. Police learned that Tanya had gone on a trip with her boyfriend, Jay, who was still missing. Jay's truck was also missing, prompting them to consider his involvement. The Jay family refuted this, saying he is gentle, loves Tanya, has never been aggressive, does not own a gun, and would also find it difficult to obtain one. While police were searching for Jay, they received another call. A bartender in Bellingham, about 18 miles from where the body was found, picked up a wallet and keys on the road. The wallet contained identification in the name of Tanya van Cuylenborg. At first, he didn't call the police, but instead took the items back to the bar, thinking the owner would come looking for them. But after seeing the news of Tanya's murder on TV, he immediately called 911. The police searched the area around the bar and found, under the back porch, several plastic zip ties identical to the kind used to bind Tanya's hands, along with rubber gloves and a partially used box of ammunition. Nearby, an officer spotted a van. It was the same vehicle Tanya and Jay had been driving. Inside the car was a mess. Belongings were scattered and damaged. But there were also a few important clues. Numerous receipts that help reconstruct Tanya and Jay's journey, and a ferry ticket indicating they had reached Seattle, where something terrible may have happened. Detectives also noticed that the camera Tanya had been carrying was missing. Since it was not at the scene of the body, they suspected the killer had taken it. The van's interior was stained with blood, which forensic teams collected for testing. Although DNA analysis was still new, a Seattle lab examined the samples and identified 3 profiles: Tanya's, Jay's, and an unknown male's. With no national DNA database at the time, the third profile could not be matched. This evidence led detectives to conclude Jay was likely not the killer. The pressing questions became, was Jay still alive? And where was he? Sadly, the answer emerged quickly. On November 26, a group of friends hunting a few dozen miles from Seattle discovered a body in the bushes near a small river bridge and alerted police. The victim was quickly identified as Jay Cook. He had multiple bruises, and the apparent cause of death was strangulation. Because of the crime's brutality, detectives considered that the killer might have known Jay and acted out of a personal motive. They also believed Jay was killed first. Since his body was found closer to Seattle, the killer then likely drove Tanya in the van toward the Canadian border, murdered her, and left her in a wooded area. Forensic experts found semen on Tanya, and DNA analysis matched blood found in the van, indicating the same man was responsible. However, his identity remained unknown. Investigators attempted to trace Tanya and Jay's movements using receipts found in the car to establish a timeline. After taking the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, Tanya and Jay bought food at a store. They then headed toward Seattle. But Jay appears to have missed the fastest route. This was supported by a receipt from a store in Hoodsport and a clerk's testimony. The clerk remembered a young couple matching their description who asked for directions to the ferry. The clerk also noted a suspicious detail. A man in a brown raincoat seemed to be following them. He entered the store right after them and left right after them, although she didn't see where he went. A later receipt placed Tanya and Jay at a store in the town of Allen. After that, They reached the ferry near Seattle and bought a ticket. Several witnesses saw them in that area, but their movements afterward could not be traced. Police reviewed individuals in Seattle with violent crime histories, but found no viable suspects. Despite having the killer's DNA, investigators had no way to identify him. They suspected he had offended before. Given the sophistication of the crime, detectives believe the killer may have been stalking Tanya and Jay for some time and kidnapped them when they arrived in Seattle. He might have gained their trust by asking for a ride and later used a gun to control them. Detectives also suspect he deliberately left Tanya's belongings and rubber gloves in plain sight to taunt police, implying that fingerprints would be useless because he was wearing gloves. Several fingerprints found in the van did not belong to Tanya or Jay, but investigators doubted they were the killers for the same reason. The prints did not match any database entries and did not advance the case. For weeks, detectives searched for leads and checked suspects without success. Then, in December, about a month after the murders, something unexpected happened. Tanya's and Jay's families began receiving letters and postcards from someone claiming to be the killer. The sender confessed, mocked the families, and bragged that he would never be caught. Investigators tried to trace the source, but that was extremely difficult at the time. They could only determine the city the letter was sent from, but that wasn't enough to identify the culprit. The letters kept coming, often on holidays, apparently to inflict maximum pain. They were mailed from multiple cities and states, suggesting the sender traveled frequently. Still, investigators were not certain the writer was the killer. In high-profile cases, hoax letters from people pretending to be the perpetrator are unfortunately common. Since then, the case saw little progress for years. Detectives continued pursuing suspects and considered the possibility of a serial killer. This idea stemmed from two other couples being abducted in the same region around that time. Though police considered the connections weak, over the following years, several serial killers were arrested in the area, but none were tied to the murders of Tanya and Jay. In 2003, the case was reopened, and the perpetrator's DNA was entered into the FBI database. No matches were found. Investigators still believe the killer likely had a lengthy criminal history, but had either avoided arrest or been arrested before mandatory DNA collection. In 2010, the case was featured on a popular national TV show, generating many new tips. Someone called and said they knew who sent the letter to Tanya and Jay's family. This lead pointed to a 78-year-old Seattle man. Investigations revealed that he had traveled across the United States, and the locations he visited matched the locations where the letters were sent. Detectives concluded he had written the letters, but had no role in the murders. The man showed clear signs of severe mental illness, and his DNA did not match the blood and semen from the crime scenes. This confirmed the letters were from an unrelated individual, not the killer. The case remained cold for several more years. In 2018, detectives learned about Parabon, a company that creates composite sketches from DNA. With no other leads, they tried this approach. Parabon produced age-progressed sketches of the killer, which police released to the media. New useful tips emerged. Investigators then turned to genetic genealogy. Parabon uploaded the killer's DNA to a public database to search for distant relatives. They quickly identified a person who could be the suspect's second cousin and traced the genealogy. The goal is to find a man who lived in Seattle or the surrounding area in 1987, matching the age and other criteria. With the cousin's help, they identified a suspect, 55 years old, William Earl Talbot, a truck driver living in a Seattle suburb. Before making an arrest, police needed to confirm the DNA match. After a brief surveillance, they collected a discarded coffee cup from William. The saliva provided a DNA profile that perfectly matched the killer's. In mid-May 2018, 30 years after the murders, investigators arrested William. He denied involvement, and the case went to trial in 2019. The defense attorneys sought to dismiss the DNA evidence, arguing that the semen on Tanya's body was likely consensual, and that there was no direct evidence tying William to Jay's murder. However, The prosecution had a strong argument. In 1987, fingerprints found on the van did not match Tanya, Jay, or anyone in the database. Those prints now matched Williams. Another piece of evidence came from Williams' friend, who said he saw a brown truck parked in front of Williams' house in 1987 that was not Williams. This suggests that William may have driven the truck home, though it is unclear whether it was before or after the crime. Additionally, Williams' home was only a few miles from where Jay's body was found, suggesting he was familiar with the area. None of Williams' relatives attended the trial, but they provided extensive information to investigators. They described him as consistently aggressive, and many family members feared him. Most cut off contact after he moved out. When they learned of the charges, they were not surprised and considered him capable of such crimes. The prosecution argued that William asked Tanya and Jay for a ride to Seattle under false pretenses. After they arrived at night, he allegedly used a gun to force them to drive to a remote location. He then killed them at separate sites, discarded Tanya's belongings, abandoned the van in another town, and avoided detection for 30 years. Despite the lack of a confession and some missing details, the evidence was compelling enough that almost no one doubted William's guilt. The trial concluded in June 2019. William was convicted of both murders and sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. It was the first case in which genetic genealogy led to a conviction. After the verdict, an unexpected issue arose. William's attorneys appealed, claiming the jury was biased, violating his constitutional rights and making the jurors unfit to serve. A judge overturned the conviction in 2021 and ordered a new trial. However, in 2022, a higher court reinstated the original conviction. William's possible involvement in other crimes remains unclear. He had prior convictions for lesser offenses, but had never been charged with murder. Investigators suspect he may be connected to other unsolved cases because the killings of Tanya and Jay did not appear amateurish. The methodical execution and his decades-long evasion of law enforcement suggest he may have killed before, though we may never know for sure. A suburban house has been transformed into a place of horror, with bloodstains splattered all over the walls. The most haunting detail is the tiny fingerprint of a child that remains. This was the sight that greeted Jennifer O'Brien when she entered her parents' home to retrieve her son, Nathan. The case was so macabre and deeply disturbing that many struggled to accept it as reality. Regardless, it happened, and the whole country would soon be watching the investigation that followed. This story brings us to Park Hill, a neighborhood located within the city of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Known for its tranquil atmosphere and the warmth of its local residents, Park Hill offers a picturesque environment with well-maintained homes, tree-lined streets, modern infrastructure, and a welcoming sense of community. The area radiates calm, stability, making it a highly desirable place for families seeking peace and security. These qualities were precisely what drew the Lickneys family to settle in here. Alvin Lickness, a beloved father and grandfather, was 66 years old at the time. He was a man of authority, respect, both within his family and throughout his professional life. With retirement approaching, Alvin eagerly looked forward to beginning a new chapter, one filled with freedom after years of responsibility. His wife, Kathy Lickness, aged 53, was the heart of the family. She was not only a devoted wife but also her daughter's closest confidant. Her caring and nurturing nature allowed her to create a warm, inviting home for everyone she loved. Park Hill had been their home for many years, but they had recently decided it was time to downsize. They were preparing for a move to Edmonton, planning a more modest living arrangement as they entered retirement. Alvin and Kathy stood on the threshold of enjoying this long-awaited stage of life. They listed their house for sale, along with several pieces of furniture and household items. Their daughter, Jennifer O'Brien, visited her parents' home one final time with her children, including her cheerful 5-year-old son, Nathan. In just 1 week, her parents were scheduled to leave this house permanently. Jennifer felt a quiet sadness. This was the place where she grew up and spent her childhood with her siblings. Alvin and Kathy had also secured an apartment in Mazatlan, Mexico, where they planned to spend the winter enjoying the warm sun before eventually moving on to Edmonton. But they would never have the chance to enjoy their golden years. Just 1 day later, their hopes and plans vanished into a nightmare that engulfed everything around them. Nathan O'Brien was a lively child with a cherubic face, perpetually tousled, sun-kissed hair. He was the middle child among Jennifer's 3 children. Known for his love of superhero costumes and his friendly, outgoing nature, Nathan was adored by nearly everyone he met. He easily made friends with both children and adults. Nathan possessed an endless curiosity for the world around him, always eager to explore something new. Jennifer and the children spent a pleasant day at the family home in Park Hill. As the evening approached and darkness settled in, Jennifer decided to stay a little longer rather than drive immediately with 3 tired children. Nathan, worn out from playing outdoors, fell asleep almost instantly. At approximately 11 o'clock p.m., Jennifer decided to take her other children home, leaving Nathan asleep beside his grandmother. With plans to return for him in the morning, Nathan had long wished to spend the night with his grandparents, and Jennifer didn't want to deny him that simple joy. On the morning of June 30, 2014, Jennifer arrived at her parents' home to pick up her son, unaware that she was about to witness something beyond comprehension. The front door was standing wide open. As she cautiously looked inside, she saw pools of blood, and a heavy, metallic odor filled the air. Blood appeared everywhere. On the beds, the walls, the floors, and throughout the hallway, a dark trail of sneaker prints and smeared, bloody streaks suggested that someone had been dragged through the house. The most devastating sight of all was a small child's handprint pressed against the wall, as if the boy had leaned on it to steady himself. Jennifer couldn't find her parents or her 5-year-old son anywhere in the house. She immediately called her husband, telling him she believed her entire family had been killed and their bodies taken away. Shaking and overwhelmed, Jennifer then dialed emergency services and repeated the same message. The dispatcher instructed her to return to her car and lock the doors immediately, in case the person responsible was still inside the house or nearby. Jennifer sat behind the steering wheel, staring at the home where she had spent so many happy moments with her family. The image of the small handprint on the wall replayed endlessly in her mind. Police officers arrived quickly and entered the house. They conducted a thorough search of every room, but no bodies were found. Alvin and Kathy Lickness, along with little Nathan, had vanished without a trace. An Amber Alert was soon issued. Despite the horrific condition of the house, investigators held on to hope that the 3 had been abducted and were being held somewhere alive. Law enforcement officers collected DNA samples throughout the Lickness home but initially found no fingerprints or DNA belonging to an obvious suspect. During the forensic examination, investigators discovered a tooth inside the residence, believed to belong to Alvin Lickness. Blood found on a pair of heavy dumbbells in the garage was later confirmed to match his DNA. Investigators also noted that a lock on a side door had been damaged, suggesting that the attacker may have entered the house that way during the night. Police questioned approximately 200 people who had attended the estate sale held at the home shortly before the disappearance, as hundreds of officers searched tirelessly for the missing family and found no trace of them anywhere. Investigators were forced to return to the starting point, the Lickness home. Detectives considered the possibility that Nathan may have witnessed something terrifying and tried to hide. They carefully searched every closet, storage space, and area beneath the beds. anywhere a frightened child might conceal himself. But found nothing. For weeks, police continued to believe that Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan might be alive somewhere, and that the injuries sustained in the home might not have been fatal. As time passed, however, that hope began to fade. Despite extensive searches, no bodies were found. It became increasingly clear that this was not a kidnapping but a brutal attack on 3 members of the same family. The person responsible remained at large, Nathan's parents, unwilling to accept the possibility that their son had passed away. Contacted him directly through televised appeals. They reminded Nathan that he was a superhero, telling him he was brave, strong, and could handle anything. They promised they would find him and bring him home. Jennifer, speaking through tears, begged her son not to be afraid. The people watching her desperate request were touched. They didn't know for sure if the child was still alive. The public shared in the family's anguish, feeling profound sympathy but powerless to help. The Amber Alert failed to produce any immediate, concrete results. Over the course of several days, police received more than 1,300 tips from across the region. Residents of nearby homes and businesses did everything they could to assist the investigation, voluntarily submitting hours of surveillance footage recorded during the night in question. Detectives painstakingly reviewed hundreds of hours of video footage, searching for anything out of place. Eventually, something subtle yet troubling emerged. On the night Alvin and Kathy Lickness, along with their 5-year-old grandson Nathan O'Brien, disappeared, a vehicle was seen repeatedly driving through the Park Hill neighborhood. In one frame, a figure appeared lingering near the Lickness residence in the early morning hours. Shortly afterward, a pickup truck was captured traveling north, away from Calgary. In the bed of the truck was a large object concealed beneath a white covering. Police quickly released flyers showing an image of a late 1980s to early 1990s green Ford F-150 pickup truck, believed to have been present on the Lickness Street that night. Investigators were eager to identify both the vehicle and its driver, suspecting they could hold crucial information about the disappearance of Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan. Publicizing the image proved to be a pivotal decision. A woman who recognized the truck contacted authorities. The caller was Patty Douglas, and the truck belonged to her brother, Douglas Garland, 56. Douglas Garland had a long, troubling history. In his youth, he was expelled from medical school after being caught cheating. Over the years, he had been repeatedly arrested for weapons-related offenses and assaults, though charges were often dropped or never pursued, allowing him to evade lasting consequences. In 1992, Douglas was convicted after police discovered a methamphetamine lab on his rural property. To avoid arrest and imprisonment, he fled to British Columbia, where he assumed the identity of a teenager who had died in a car crash. Under this false identity, Douglas lived undetected for several years, working in a laboratory, later collecting unemployment benefits while concealing his true name. In 2000, authorities uncovered the deception. Douglas was arrested and ultimately sentenced to 6 months in prison for banned substances-related offenses and identity theft. Psychological assessments at the time characterized him as mentally unstable but not prone to violent behavior. Based on those evaluations, he served only his sentence and was released. In July 2014, police detained Douglas Garland once again, this time at a bus stop in Calgary, citing an outstanding charge related to document forgery. Douglas refused to cooperate and provided no information to investigators. Let's get back to the case. Given the fear that the Lickness couple and Nathan might still be alive and in danger, immediate, police authorized an urgent search of Douglas's rural property, invoking an emergency legal exception rather than waiting for a full search warrant. An emergency response team launched what was initially treated as a potential hostage rescue operation, storming the over 16-hectare farm where Douglas lived with his elderly parents. Investigators believed that a rural property offered the greatest opportunity to conceal victims. Despite an intensive search, neither the missing family members nor any bodies were found. One detail, however, drew attention: a barrel near a greenhouse that was still smoldering inside. Officers found only ash, no blood, no identifiable remains, and no immediate physical evidence. With no grounds to hold him at that time, Douglas Garland was released on bail under strict conditions, including an order not to return to the farm. Soon after, police obtained a comprehensive search warrant. More than 300 officers meticulously combed the property, surrounding fields, and nearby wetlands, while forensic specialists focused on the structures themselves. Deep within the basement, investigators uncovered disturbing materials, including books and manuals containing graphic and violent imagery. Further searches revealed boxes filled with restraints, some small enough to fit a child's wrists. Additional items included hacksaw blades, leather straps, bone saws, knives, firearms, even a straitjacket. Authorities also discovered a computer hard drive hidden beneath the rafters in the basement. The hard drive contained an extensive collection of material related to violence. Gathered through meticulous online research, Douglas had downloaded numerous documents and instructions from the internet, including information on how to attack victims in the early morning hours to maximize the element of surprise, descriptions of painful methods of torture, and guides explaining how to kill without experiencing emotional involvement. The hard drive also contained disturbing images related to Douglas's personal obsessions and fantasies. On shelves nearby, investigators found books focused on poisoning and violent crime. Among them were photographs involving adults wearing diapers, with their hands and feet restrained, some appearing unconscious or possibly deceased. Investigators also uncovered a kit designed for impersonating a woman in the basement. It included silicone breast prostheses, 2 long blonde wigs, racks of women's clothing, and an extensive shoe collection consisting of 89 pairs of boots, shoes, sneakers that fit Douglas's feet. One empty shoebox found in the closet drew particular attention. The sole pattern printed on the box could have been compared to an imprint found at the Lickness home, but the corresponding pair of shoes was missing. Meanwhile, Douglas violated the conditions of his release and returned to the farmhouse without notifying Calgary police. Detectives monitoring his movements believed he intended to destroy or conceal evidence hidden in the basement. His second arrest occurred as Douglas attempted to move through dense trees and thick brush, while a police helicopter hovered overhead. He was formally charged with the murders of Nathan O'Brien, Catherine "Kathy" Lickness, and Alvin Lickness. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since their disappearance, and although no bodies had yet been recovered, prosecutors proceeded based on an overwhelming volume of evidence. More than 1,400 individual items collected during the investigation. At that stage, it had not yet been definitively proven that Douglas Garland was the man who carried out the brutal attack on Alvin, Kathy, and Nathan. The investigation continued without pause. Detectives decided to re-examine the contents of a smoldering barrel that had been noticed during the initial search of the farm. As forensic specialists carefully sifted through the ashes, they made a chilling discovery. Among the remains were a child's tooth, charred human tissue, a metal eyeglass frame, and numerous fragments of human bone. A subsequent investigation revealed a layered history between Douglas and the Lickness family, stretching back many years. Patty Douglas, Douglas's sister and the woman who alerted police about the pickup truck, was the common-law wife of Alan Lickness, one of Alvin and Kathy's sons. This family connection drew immediate attention from investigators. It soon emerged that Alvin and Douglas had worked together years earlier. In 2006, Alvin, a successful businessman, was seeking technical assistance for a project, and Alan suggested Douglas as a potential collaborator. Douglas, who possessed some technical knowledge of mechanical engineering, began working with Alvin on the development of an industrial pump for the oil and gas industry. The pump itself was Alvin's invention, and Douglas was hired to help refine, improve certain aspects of the design. However, the project was never commercialized. By early 2007, the working relationship came to an end. After losing his position, Douglas became increasingly resentful. The termination appeared to fuel a deep-seated anger that lingered for years, gradually hardening into bitterness. Investigators think Douglas's anger built up over time until he violently destroyed what he blamed for his humiliation. While there was no evidence that Nathan had been a specific target, authorities believed Douglas was unwilling to leave any witnesses behind. His actions showed no regard for age or innocence. His focus was on revenge. In January 2017, Douglas Garland stood trial in a packed Calgary courtroom, where he pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. Throughout the proceedings, he filed no motions and remained largely expressionless. The trial drew national attention, becoming one of the most closely followed criminal cases in Canada, as the public struggled to comprehend the brutality of the crime. Just one day before their disappearance, Alvin and Kathy Lickness had held an estate sale at their Park Hill home, preparing to sell the property and downsize. Douglas, who had harbored resentment toward Alvin for years over the failed pump project and the associated patent, appeared to seize this moment. Investigators believe, in the early hours of June 30, 2014, Douglas gained entry to the Lickness home by drilling through the lock on a side door. Instructions on how to defeat such locks were later found on his computer. While the household slept, Douglas went to the master bedroom, where Alvin was resting, and struck him multiple times with a heavy blunt object. He then moved to the guest bedroom, where Kathy and 5-year-old Nathan were sleeping. DNA evidence confirmed that both were attacked there. The extent of blood loss indicated that Kathy also suffered a severe blow from a blunt instrument. The precise cause of Nathan's injuries could not be determined, but forensic evidence clearly showed that he had been bleeding. Despite the extensive bloodshed inside the house, forensic experts concluded that all 3 victims were still alive when Douglas dragged them from their beds and forced them out of the home. Investigators believed he transported them in the back of his pickup truck, bound and concealed beneath a white covering later observed in surveillance footage. No usable fingerprints or DNA belonging to Douglas were found at the residence. Consistent with evidence that he had studied detailed online instructions on how to avoid detection, Douglas then drove the victims to his parents' rural farm near Airdrie, located more than 30 kilometers from the Lickness home. Investigators later determined that Nathan and his grandparents were subjected to extreme violence at the property. DNA belonging to all 3 victims was recovered from multiple tools found on the farm, including meat hooks, bone saws, and knives. Their genetic material was also discovered on the exterior of a pair of rubber boots near one of the outbuildings. Inside that structure, a blood-stained light switch contained DNA matching both Alvin and Kathy Lickness. A forensic computer specialist testified about the discovery of photographs of Kathy and Alvin among deleted files recovered from a hard drive belonging to Douglas. The evidence suggested that Douglas had been monitoring the lives of those he considered his enemies, likely through publicly available information and social media platforms. Douglas's own mother also took the stand and testified against her son. She described him as a solitary man who had no close friends, though she added that he was intelligent, enjoyed reading, and helped around the family home. She testified that Douglas had earned a Bachelor of Science degree, later enrolled at the University of Alberta, but studied there for only a short period before suffering a nervous breakdown. When she later saw a television report about the disappearance of the Lickness family and mentioned it to Douglas, he reportedly said that he did not want to talk about Alvin. She also stated that she did not hear her son leave the house that night and therefore could not provide specific details about his movements. As expected, the defense argued that there was no direct forensic or scientific evidence placing Douglas Garland inside the Lickness home on the night of the attack. Defense counsel emphasized that no eyewitness had seen Douglas commit the murders and that there was no definitive proof showing how or why the 3 victims had been killed. According to the defense, The case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. On February 6, 2017, near the conclusion of the trial, prosecutors presented what they described as a pivotal piece of evidence, one discovered purely by chance. At 9:30 a.m. on July 1, 2014, the day after the attack at the Lickness residence, a small aircraft operated by an aerial mapping company was flying over airspace near Airdrie, Alberta, conducting routine photographic surveys of the area and surrounding communities north of Calgary. The aircraft captured images every 3 seconds and, by extraordinary coincidence, recorded 2 photographs that would later be introduced in court and significantly strengthen the case against Douglas. The images appeared to show 3 human figures lying face down on the ground near several outbuildings south of the main farmhouse. 2 of the figures were clearly adults, unclothed except for white material wrapped around their waists. Experts were able to estimate their approximate heights, one about 6 feet 2 inches, another about 5 feet 6 inches. A third, much smaller figure was visible nearby, lying on its side in the grass close to a burn barrel. The prosecution suggested that the smaller figure was a child. The pilot who operated the aircraft testified that when he flew over the same area approximately 26 hours later, the figures were no longer visible in the photographs. In this tragic case, the silence of the victims spoke volumes. No intact bodies were ever recovered, only fragments. The sole physical confirmation of their deaths was found among the ashes in the burn barrel charred tissue. Bone fragments, and remains belonging to Nathan O'Brien and his grandparents. Investigators concluded that after dismembering the bodies, the killer attempted to destroy them by fire in a crude and prolonged process resembling cremation. As these horrifying details were presented in court, Douglas remained outwardly unmoved, at times appearing to take notes. He showed no visible signs of remorse. After several hours of emotionally devastating testimony and approximately 10 hours of jury deliberation, a verdict was reached. The judge presiding over the Calgary triple murder case imposed the harshest sentence allowed under Canadian law. Douglas Garland, convicted of the first-degree murders of Nathan O'Brien, Alvin Lickness, and Kathy Lickness, was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, with parole ineligibility periods totaling 75 years. In practical terms, Douglas would be 129 years old before he could even apply for parole. In the period following Douglas's sentencing, reports indicated that life in custody was far from easy for him. As the details of the crimes became widely known among other inmates, he was subjected to hostility and abuse because of the brutal killing of 3 innocent people, including a 5-year-old child, over a grievance that dated back several years. His actions had marked him as one of the most despised offenders in the prison system. The devastating events of the case left a deep and lasting impact on the family and on society as a whole. The void created by the loss of Alvin, Kathy, and young Nathan was immeasurable. The consequences of this tragedy extended far beyond the courtroom, embedding themselves in the hearts of everyone who had known and loved them. No words can fully capture the pain endured by Nathan's parents. Jennifer and Rod O'Brien continue to face this loss day after day, raising their 2 sons and learning how to live in a world where their little superhero is no longer by their side. Amid unimaginable grief, Rod and Jennifer found a way to transform their pain into something meaningful. In Nathan's memory, they established the Nathan O'Brien Children's Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving the lives of children facing hardship. The foundation was created to honor Nathan by giving other children opportunities, hope, and support, things his parents believe every child deserves. Nathan loved sports, and in his honor, the foundation organizes annual sporting events for children, including hockey programs. Imagining how much joy he would have found in being part of those games. Another thing Nathan loved dearly was talking with his father before bedtime. Their final conversation remains etched in Rod's memory. That night, Nathan asked what heaven was like, an unusual question for a 5-year-old. He spoke about being a superhero, flying through the sky and cutting through the clouds with his hands. He told his father that one day he would meet his parents in heaven. In hindsight, Rod has often wondered whether his son somehow sensed what was to come. Nathan's mother, Jennifer, watches with tears in her eyes as her son's friends grow older, knowing she will never see her own boy grow into adulthood. The Lickness and O'Brien case remains one of the most tragic chapters in Calgary's history, leaving a permanent scar not only on the city, but on the entire country. The deaths of Alvin, Kathy, and little Nathan stands as a painful reminder of how fragile life can be, and of the importance of cherishing those we love. Delphine Jubilar. Born in 1987 in Gaillac, she worked nights as a nurse, juggling that demanding schedule with raising 2 children. The family lived in Cagnacles Mines, where life seemed routine and predictable. On the surface, everything appeared stable and ordinary. Early in the morning on December 16, 2020, a little after 4:00 a.m., Cédric Jubilar called the emergency services to report that his wife, Delphine, had been missing for several hours. He said he had last seen her late the previous evening. He was unable to give an exact time, instead mentioning a vague window between around 11:00 p.m. and the early hours of the morning, according to Cédric. Before contacting the authorities, he tried to reach Delphine on his own. He messaged one of Delphine's close friends, assuming she might have gone to stay with her friend. In that message, he asked the friend to tell Delphine to come home. The response came quickly. Delphine was not there. Cédric couldn't get in touch with her, but he waited until after sunrise to contact the police. He explained that he hoped she would come back by herself overnight. However, phone records later revealed that Cédric had been awake, moving around the house, and repeatedly turning the Wi-Fi on and off between 4:00 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. Behavior investigators viewed as highly suspicious. The police were there immediately. A thorough sweep of the house and backyard revealed no signs that Delphine had left during the night. Her car remained in the garage. Her belongings were untouched, and both children were asleep in their beds. Officers observed nothing to suggest she had planned to go anywhere, especially not in the middle of the night. These early findings immediately cast doubt on Cédric's version of events, marking the true beginning of the investigation. 2 neighbors testified they heard a terrifying scream coming from the Jubilar home shortly after 11:00 p.m. Louis, the couple's 6-year-old son, reported hearing his parents argue loudly last night. He also said to investigators, "His father screamed, his mother fell," a statement that became one of the most important early clues. When police entered the home, there were no signs of an attack. Everything appeared normal. No disturbance. However, in a disturbing detail, investigators discovered that the couple's blanket was found in the drum of the washing machine, despite it being summer. Inside the machine, detectives also found fragments of Cédric's broken glasses, raising even more suspicions about a violent incident occurring before the wash cycle was started. Authorities then deployed K-9 teams, thermal cameras, drones, and ground units to comb through the surrounding areas of Cagnacles Mines. Locals rallied quickly as well, forming volunteer search parties. Within days, nearly 1,000 people were scouring the rugged landscape. Steep ravines, dense underbrush, and narrow trails that required caution, precision. In one of the most difficult-to-access locations, investigators found several of her personal items: her phone, pieces of clothing, and a knife. The area was completely unlit, and the scattered arrangement of the objects suggested they had been thrown or placed there, not accidentally dropped during a walk. Even more puzzling, there were no physical traces showing she had made her way there independently. Officers noted that even with a strong flashlight, The nighttime route would have been incredibly difficult. Forensic experts later concluded the items had likely been staged to simulate a voluntary disappearance or nighttime walk. A theory that strengthened suspicions of deliberate manipulation. Forensic analysis of her phone added another disturbing detail. The device's last recorded signal came on the morning of December 16th, just over a mile from her home. Moments later, it abruptly shut down, not from a drained battery, but from what appeared to be a sudden, intentional interruption. This sharp cutoff became a critical clue. In January and February 2021, Delphine's phone exhibited strange behavior. It seemed to automatically activate internal functions, sending short, individual signals. This led investigators to wonder if someone had remotely accessed or physically tampered with the phone. They contacted Samsung for answers. Samsung stated that these signals could occur during extensive diagnostic tests. Automated checks might trigger background signals that phone companies interpret as the phone turning on. Despite this explanation, investigators considered several possibilities: a software error, remote access, or unintended consequences from examining the phone during the investigation. No cause was definitively eliminated. In addition to the technical analysis, detectives investigated Delphine's personal life, focusing on her communication with a man she was dating. They had been making future plans, and she sent him a personal photo the night before she disappeared. However, his alibi was quickly confirmed by independent sources, proving he was home all night. Investigators then looked into his wife, Kate, the day before Delphine went missing. Kate called Delphine's phone several times. While this created tension, investigators found no solid evidence connecting Kate to Delphine's disappearance. It seemed more like a personal dispute than a criminal lead. Meanwhile, Delphine's extramarital affair also made investigators suspect Cedric. Another man briefly drew attention early in the investigation, someone who had previously been involved in a car-related dispute with the Jubilar family. Despite the past tension, his involvement was quickly ruled out. He provided a solid, independently verified alibi, so investigators found no reason to pursue him further. Neighbors also mentioned a van that had been parked near Jubilar home for several days before Delphine's disappearance. Investigators located the owner, conducted interviews, and reviewed his movements. After comparing times, routes, and phone data, no connection to the case was found. Investigators then focused on Delphine's car. Her vehicle was parked differently than usual. The position didn't match her habits. Inside, investigators found fresh condensation on the windows, a sign that someone had recently been inside. One theory was that the car had been used during the night and later returned. As interviews continued, inconsistencies accumulated. The times Cedric mentioned didn't align with digital timestamps. Several aspects of his story shifted between statements. He initially claimed Delphine went out to walk the dog, but the dog was found clean, dry, and asleep, with no signs of having been outdoors on a cold December night. This contradiction became one of the central elements of the case. This pattern, behavioral oddities, shifting details, and tech data not matching the story, gradually pushed Cedric to the center of the investigation. On June 16th, officers arrived at the Jubilar home early in the morning, conducted a full search in the presence of official witnesses, and took Cedric into custody. He was formally named a suspect in Delphine's disappearance and the alleged concealment of her body. Following the arrest, investigators expanded their focus to examine Cedric's personal history. He was orphaned at a young age and placed in various foster homes. According to those who knew him, this upbringing left him with deep insecurities, a strong need for approval, and emotional immaturity beneath a facade of independence. Some described him as diligent, while others said he could be manipulative, evasive, unable to cope with pressure. Within the Jubilar household, there were clear imbalances. Delphine had stable employment, steady income, long-term career prospects. Meanwhile, Cedric's work was inconsistent. He often depended on his wife's financial stability. Investigators also discovered that Cedric had searched online weeks earlier for how to kill someone with a knife without making noise. A chilling detail later presented at trial. After completing crucial forensic examinations, tactical teams resumed active field operations. They searched caves, abandoned tunnels, dense wooded ravines, and steep, hazardous terrain requiring specialized mountaineering support. The regions surrounding Cagnac-les mines were combed once again. This time, with advanced thermal imaging drones and technical teams capable of accessing difficult locations. Authorities were determined to leave no possibility unexplored. The extensive searches highlighted the serious nature of Delphine's disappearance. Even in the initial hours, when missing people typically leave clues, investigators found nothing. There was no safe route she could have taken at night. No indication she left willingly, and no sign her body had been moved. This complete lack of evidence was a major red flag for investigators. It suggested that whatever happened to Delphine likely occurred in or very close to her home. A specific location quickly became a focal point: an abandoned, fire-damaged farm. A former cellmate of Cedric Jubilar alleged that he had heard Cedric admit to burying Delphine's body there. Consequently, investigators conducted a thorough search of the farm. They used ground-penetrating radar, digging equipment, and meticulously examined every section of soil. However, the search yielded no results. They found no bones, clothing fibers, or any biological evidence. There was nothing to indicate that the farm had ever been used as a burial site. Meanwhile, DNA testing was difficult because Delphine's body was never found. Without her body, investigators couldn't get a confirmed DNA sample to compare with any evidence they found. This meant DNA tests couldn't give definitive results. Investigators also conducted a meticulous forensic sweep of the Peugeot 207 Delphine drove. They examined the trunk, cabin, floor mats, and all interior compartments. No signs of a struggle, movement of heavy objects, or attempts to clean up biological material were detected. Vehicle data logs showed no nighttime trips and no unusual changes in mileage, reducing the likelihood that her car had played any role in the disappearance. Following Cedric's arrest, his lawyers focused on the lack of direct evidence against him. They filed 7 motions asking for him to be released, arguing that because there was no body or physical evidence after so much time, he should no longer be held in custody. However, the court rejected each motion, stating that there was not enough reason to alter the terms of his imprisonment. His lawyers also argued that the isolation, limited communication, and being treated as the primary suspect for an extended period caused him excessive psychological distress. These points were key to a public campaign that depicted Cedric as being detained without significant proof. Prosecutors, however, firmly opposed Cedric's release. They highlighted contradictions in his statements, the risk that he could influence witnesses, and the possibility that he might hide or destroy information still being evaluated. In complex, bodiless cases like this, judicial decisions hinge not only on hard evidence but also on assessments of potential risks. This reasoning explains why the court repeatedly rejected every request for his release. Legal arguments stretched on for months. Both sides continued strengthening their positions, yet the outcome never changed. Cedric remained in custody while investigators moved forward with the case. In 2023, volunteers launched a new round of searches, focusing on rugged areas previously inaccessible due to steep terrain and dense vegetation. But this effort also ended in disappointment. Not a single clue surfaced. The case finally reached trial in September 2025 at the Cour d'Assises du Tarn in Albi. The prosecution presented a mountain of circumstantial evidence. The scream heard by neighbors at 11:00 p.m. Cedric's inconsistent timelines. The washing machine, running at 4:00 a.m., with a duvet inside. Broken glasses found in the washing machine. His son's testimony. His How to Kill Quietly, Google searches, and his own recorded prison conversations, in which he appeared to mock the investigation, on October 17, 2025. After 4 weeks of hearings and 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Cédric Jubillar guilty of the murder of his wife Delphine. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, the exact term requested by the prosecution. The court rejected the defense's argument of accidental death during a domestic argument and fully accepted the prosecution's reconstruction. A premeditated act, driven by jealousy and rage after Delphine announced her intention to leave him for another man. Right after the verdict was announced, Cédric Jubillar's lawyers said they would appeal. As of December 2, 2025, the appeal is in progress, and Cédric Jubillar is still in jail. Delphine's body has never been found. Despite the conviction, her family continues to search, refusing to bury an empty coffin. They insist that one day they will bring Delphine home,